Hey guys, let me ask you something. When you think about Greek mythology, what's the first image that pops into your head? Maybe Zeus hurling thunderbolts, maybe Aphrodite stepping out of the sea foam, or maybe just some dusty textbook diagram you barely remember from school. And honestly, I get it. That's the highlight reel, the part everyone knows. But here's the thing, what you're not picturing is how strange, how raw, and how deeply human these stories really are. They're not just tales of gods and monsters. They're about fear, about power, about love, betrayal, hope, and about the endless cycle of time itself. So, across this series, we're going to slow things down. We're not just listing myths. We're sinking into them. We'll explore the rise of the Titans, the fears of Cronus, the secret birth of Zeus, the fading of the Golden Age, and we'll do it the way myths were always meant to be told, slowly, richly, like a story by firelight, unfolding one breath at a time. So get comfortable. Pour yourself some tea, turn down the lights, and let the noise of the day slip away. Because this is the entire story of Greek mythology. Not rushed, not simplified, but told as a journey, a rhythm, a dream. And tonight, we begin at the very beginning. In the beginning, there was nothing. Not the kind of nothing you might imagine when you close your eyes at night. Not darkness, not silence, not even emptiness as we understand it. There was something far more profound. There was chaos. Chaos was not a place. It was not a thing. It was the absence of all things, and yet somehow, it contained the possibility of everything. Imagine, if you can, a vast and limitless void stretching in all directions, though direction itself had not yet been invented. There was no up, no down, no forward, no back. There was no light to cast shadows, no sound to break the stillness, no time to measure the passing of moments. Time itself had not yet been born. If you had been there, floating in that infinite nothingness, you would have felt neither cold nor warm, for temperature did not exist. You would have seen neither black nor white, for color had no meaning. You would have heard nothing, not even the sound of your own breath, for breath itself was a concept waiting to be dreamed into existence. Chaos was a deep well without an echo, a vast ocean without water, a sleep without dreams. And yet, within this formless void, something stirred. It was not a movement, exactly. It was more like a thought forming in the mind of the universe itself. A whisper of intention. A gentle trembling in the fabric of nothingness. And from this trembling, from this first faint pulse of existence, something began to take shape. Slowly, so slowly that even if time had existed it would have seemed like an eternity. The void began to separate, like oil and water finding their natural places, like breath condensing into mist on a cold morning. The nothingness began to divide into somethingness. And the first of these somethings, the very first being to emerge from chaos, was Gaia. Gaia, the earth, the foundation of all that would come after. She did not arrive suddenly, like a thunderclap or a flash of lightning. She emerged gradually, the way dawn creeps across the horizon, the way a flower unfolds its petals in the warmth of spring. At first, she was barely more than a feeling, a sense of solidity in the midst of formlessness. Then, bit by bit, she became real. Imagine the first grain of soil taking shape in the void, then another and another, gathering together like thoughts coalescing into an idea. Imagine the first stone forming, heavy and cool and permanent. Imagine the first mountain rising, its peak reaching toward a sky that did not yet exist. Imagine valleys deepening, plains spreading wide, rivers carving their paths through land that had never known water. Gaia was all of this. She was the deep, dark soil that would one day nourish forests. She was the bedrock beneath, solid and unshakable. She was the gentle hills and the towering mountains, the quiet meadows and the echoing canyons. She was stability itself, a place where things could rest, where things could grow, where life itself might one day take root. And she was vast, so vast that her edges seemed to stretch beyond comprehension, curving away into distances that the mind could barely grasp. She was the foundation of existence, the ground upon which all stories would unfold, the stage upon which all dramas would be played. But Gaia was not alone for long. from chaos, or perhaps from Gaia herself. For the boundaries between things were still unclear, still forming. Other beings began to emerge. There was Erebus, the deep darkness, the shadow that would always exist even when light was born. There was Nyx, the night, soft and enveloping, a blanket of darkness that would one day cover the world in gentle sleep. There was Eros, not yet the mischievous god of love, with his arrows and his games, but something far more primal, the force of attraction itself, the pull that draws things together, the desire that makes creation possible. But the most important of these early beings, the one whose story would intertwine most closely with Gaia's own, was Uranus. Uranus, the sky. He came into being as Gaia's equal and opposite, her complement and her mirror. Where she was solid, he was ethereal. Where she was grounded, he was limitless. Where she was the foundation, he was the canopy, the vast dome that would arch over her, protecting and enclosing the space between. Imagine the first moment when the sky separated from the earth. Imagine the heavens pulling away, stretching upward and outward, creating space, creating distance, creating the possibility of perspective. Uranus was not blue at first, for there was no sun to scatter light, no atmosphere to paint the heavens in colors. He was simply vastness itself, the infinite expanse above, studded with points of light that would one day be called stars. He was beautiful, in the way that endless things are beautiful. Terrifying, in the way that infinite things are terrifying. And Gaia, looking up at him from her newly formed mountains and valleys, felt something stir within her. That primal force that Eros represented, that pull of attraction, that desire for connection. And so, earth and sky came together. Their union was not like the unions that would come later, not like the passionate embraces of gods and mortals, not like the tender meetings of lovers in moonlit gardens. Their union was something more fundamental, more cosmic. It was the joining of two halves of existence, the merging of ground and heaven, the creation of the space between where all life would eventually flourish. And from their union, children were born. The first children of Gaia and Uranus were beings of immense power and stature, creatures that reflected the raw, untamed nature of the young world. They were called the Titans, and there were 12 of them, 6 sons and 6 daughters, each one embodying some essential force or principle of existence. There was Oceanus, the great river that encircled the world, his waters flowing endlessly around the edges of the earth. There was Coeus, the axis of heaven, the pillar around which the sky turned. There was Crius, the constellations, the patterns of stars that would one day guide sailors and inspire poets. There was Hyperion, the light from above, the first glimmering of what would become the sun. There was Iapetus, mortality itself, the principle that all things must end. And there was Cronus, the youngest, whose name would one day be spoken with both reverence and fear. The daughters were equally powerful. Thea, the sight, the ability to perceive and understand. Rhea, the flow, the movement of time and seasons. Themis, justice and order, the first laws written into the fabric of existence. Mnemosyne, memory, the keeper of all that had been and would be. Phoebe, the bright intellect, the clear light of understanding. And Tethys, the nourishing waters, the rivers and streams that would bring life to the land. These Titans were magnificent beings, tall as mountains, strong as the earth itself, their forms still half-formed, still partaking of the primal chaos from which they had emerged. They walked upon their mother Gaia's surface, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. They reached up toward their father Uranus, and their fingers nearly brushed the stars. But they were not the only children. After the Titans came others, beings stranger and more terrifying. There were the Cyclopes, 3 brothers, each with a single eye in the center of his forehead, round and bright and all-seeing. Their names were Brontites, Steropes, and Arges, thunder, lightning, and brightness. And they possessed the power to forge wonders and weapons that could shake the heavens themselves. And then there were the Hecatonchires, the 100-handed ones, 3 brothers of such immense size and power that even the Titans looked upon them with awe and fear. Each had 50 heads, and 100 arms, and their strength was beyond measure. Their names were Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges, and when they moved, the earth itself groaned under their weight. Gaia loved all her children, as a mother loves, without distinction or reservation. She marveled at the Titan's beauty and strength. She admired the Cyclops' skill and vision. She embraced even the Hecatonchires, despite their fearsome appearance, for they were hers, born from her union with the sky, part of the great unfolding story of existence. But Uranus did not share her acceptance. When he looked upon the Cyclops and the Hecatonchires, he saw not children but threats. He saw beings whose power might one day rival his own, whose strength might challenge his dominion over the cosmos. He saw chaos barely contained, wildness that needed to be controlled. And so, he made a decision that would echo through all the ages to come. He took these children, these strange and mighty beings, and he thrust them back into the darkness, not into chaos, from which all things had emerged, but into Tartarus, a deep pit within Gaia herself, a prison far below the surface of the earth, as far beneath the ground as the sky was above it. There, in that lightless depth, he imprisoned the Cyclops and the Hecatonchires, hiding them away where their power could not threaten him. Gaia felt this as a wound. She felt her children being pushed back into her depths, felt their confusion and their pain, felt the injustice of their imprisonment. But she said nothing, not yet. She endured, as the earth endures, holding within herself both the beauty of the surface and the pain of the depths, both the light of day and the darkness of the hidden places. And so the world continued to take shape. The Titans walked upon the earth and learned its ways. They explored the mountains and valleys their mother had formed. They gazed up at their father's starry expanse and wondered at its mysteries. They began to understand their own natures, their own powers, their own places in the grand design. Oceanus let his waters flow, creating the great river that would define the world's edge. Hyperion climbed to the highest peaks and let his light shine forth, a pale precursor to the sun that would one day blaze across the sky. Themis began to perceive the patterns underlying existence, the laws that governed even the gods. Mnemosyne started to remember, to hold within herself the story of all that had happened, short though that story still was. And beneath it all Gaia remained, patient, enduring, the foundation upon which everything rested. She felt the weight of her imprisoned children in her depths. She felt the embrace of Uranus above, both loving and oppressive. She felt the footsteps of the Titans as they explored her surface. And she waited, as the earth waits, knowing that all things change, that all things move in cycles, that what is hidden will one day come to light. The sky above remained vast and distant, studded with stars that wheeled in their slow dance. The earth below remained solid and present, its mountains and valleys slowly weathering, slowly changing, slowly becoming more themselves. And in the space between, in that precious gap between ground and heaven, the world began to breathe. There was still no sun to mark the days, no moon to measure the months, no seasons to divide the year. But there was time now, flowing like water, moving like wind, carrying existence forward from moment to moment. There was space now, distance and dimension, the possibility of here and there, of near and far. There was form now, shapes and structures, the architecture of reality taking shape from the formless void. And there was potential, endless, boundless potential. For this was still the beginning, still the first chapter of a story that would span ages. The Titans were young, barely aware of their own power. The imprisoned Cyclops and Hecatonchires waited in darkness, their time not yet come. Uranus ruled the sky, unaware that his own actions had planted the seeds of change that would soon begin to grow. And there was potential. Endless, boundless potential. For this was still the beginning, still the first chapter of a story that would span ages. The Titans were young, barely aware of their own power. The imprisoned Cyclops and Hecatonchires waited in darkness, their time not yet come. Uranus ruled the sky, while Gaia endured in silence, holding within herself both love and sorrow. The world was still young, still learning how to breathe. The mountains were settling into their foundations, the stars finding their places in the heavens, and time itself beginning to flow like a gentle river. Everything was forming, slowly, patiently, as though the universe were preparing for what lay ahead. And so the story continued, quiet and steady, moving forward like the turning of the earth itself. Time passed in the young world, though time was still a new thing, still learning its own rhythm, still finding its pace like a river learning to flow. The Titans walked upon Gaia's surface, their footsteps echoing across empty plains and silent mountains. Uranus stretched above them, vast and unchanging, his starry expanse wheeling slowly through the darkness. And deep below, in the hidden places far beneath the Earth's surface, the imprisoned ones waited in their lightless prison. Gaia felt them there, always. She felt the Cyclopes with their single, all-seeing eyes, blinking in the darkness, their hands still and patient. She felt the Hecatonchires, their 100 arms folded against their massive bodies, their 50 heads bowed in the endless night of Tartarus. They did not cry out. They did not rage against their imprisonment. They simply existed there, in the deep places of her body, like stones lodged in her heart, like tears that could never fall, and she carried this pain silently, as the earth carries all things. She bore the weight of mountains and the weight of sorrow with the same patient endurance. When the Titans walked above, she felt their footsteps as blessings, as gentle reminders that not all her children were lost to darkness. When Uranus pressed down upon her from above, covering the world with his vast embrace, she felt both love and burden, both connection and confinement. For Uranus had not changed. He still feared what he had hidden away. He still pressed himself close to Gaia, leaving no space between earth and sky, as if by eliminating distance he could eliminate threat. There was no room for anything to grow in that compressed space, no room for change, no room for the world to breathe and expand into what it might become. The Titans moved through this narrow world like giants in a low, sea-lined room, their heads brushing the stars, their feet sinking into the earth. Oceanus flowed around the world's edge, but his waters had nowhere to deepen, nowhere to spread. Hyperion's light glowed dimly, unable to brighten without space to shine. Themis perceived the laws of justice, but saw them bent and broken by a father's fear. Mnemosyne remembered everything, including things that had not yet happened, and her memories were heavy with what was to come. And Gaia, patient Gaia, began to speak. Not with words, exactly. The earth does not speak as mortals speak, with tongue and breath and sound. She speaks in other ways. In the trembling of the ground beneath your feet, in the whisper of wind through mountain passes, in the slow grinding of stone against stone deep below the surface, in the patience of seeds waiting in darkness for the right moment to grow. She spoke to her Titan children in this language of earth and stone, of root and soil. She spoke to them of balance, that ancient principle that holds the universe together. She spoke to them of how all things must have their proper place, their proper proportion, their proper time. She spoke to them of justice, not as punishment, but as rightness, as the natural order of things finding its true shape. And she spoke to them of their siblings, the ones hidden away in darkness, the ones who had done nothing wrong, except to be born with power that frightened their father. She spoke of how they suffered in the deep places, how they waited without hope, how they had been denied the light and space that all beings deserve. Most of the Titans heard their mother's words and felt troubled. They loved their father Uranus, or at least they respected his power, his dominion over the sky. They had never known any other way of being. The world as it was seemed natural to them, even if it was cramped, even if it was dim, even if something in their hearts whispered that things could be different. Oceanus, the eldest, felt the pull of duty and tradition. He flowed in his appointed course and did not question. Coeus turned on his axis and contemplated the problem from all angles, but could not find a solution that did not involve upheaval. Crius studied the stars and saw patterns there, but could not read in them what should be done. Hyperion wanted to shine more brightly, but did not know how to create the space for his light to grow. Iapetus understood endings, but this was not yet time for an ending, or perhaps it was time for a different kind of ending than he understood. But Cronus, the youngest, listened differently. Perhaps it was because he was the last born, the one who had come into existence, when the world was already formed, already set in its patterns. Perhaps it was because he was young enough to imagine change, to conceive of a world different from the one he had always known. Or perhaps it was simply his nature, his particular gift and curse, to see what others could not see, to dare what others would not dare. He heard his mother's whispers rising from the earth beneath his feet. He felt her pain like a vibration in his bones. He understood, in a way his older siblings could not or would not, that this situation could not continue forever, that something had to change, that the world was holding its breath and waiting for someone to act. But he was cautious. He was not rash or impulsive. He walked across Gaia's surface and thought deeply about what she was asking, about what it would mean, about what would come after. He looked up at his father's vast expanse and felt both love and something else, something harder to name. Resentment, perhaps, or simply the recognition that love and rightness do not always align, that sometimes even those we love can be wrong, can cause harm, can need to be stopped. He thought about his imprisoned siblings, whom he had never met, who had been taken away before he could know them. He tried to imagine their forms, their faces, their voices. He tried to imagine what it would be like to be thrust into darkness, to be buried alive in the deep places of the earth, simply for existing, simply for being powerful, simply for being born. And slowly, over the course of ages that felt like moments and moments that felt like ages, he made his decision. He went to Gaia, not walking to a place, for she was everywhere, but rather sinking into communion with her, pressing himself against the earth, and letting her know that he had heard, that he understood, that he would act. And Gaia, who had waited so long, who had endured so much, who had carried her pain like a mountain carries snow, responded. From her own substance, from the deep places where stone becomes something harder than stone, where matter becomes will, where earth becomes intention, she drew forth a weapon. It was a sickle, curved like the crescent moon that did not yet exist, sharp as the edge between being and unbeing. It was made of adamant, that primordial substance harder than diamond, stronger than any metal that would ever be forged. It was grey as storm clouds, heavy as sorrow, cold as the space between stars, and it hummed with purpose, with inevitability, with the weight of change that has been too long delayed. Gaia gave this sickle to Cronus, and when he took it in his hands, he felt its weight not just in his muscles, but in his spirit. This was not a tool for casual use. This was not a weapon for glory or conquest. This was an instrument of transformation, of severance, of the necessary cutting away of what has become harmful so that new growth can begin. He asked his brothers to join him. He went to each of them in turn and explained what he intended to do, what their mother had asked, what justice required. And one by one, they refused. Oceanus said he could not act against his father. Coeus said the consequences were too uncertain. Crius said the stars had not aligned for such an act. Hyperion said he could not bring himself to dim his father's light. Iapetus said that while all things must end, he could not be the one to end this. So Cronus would act alone, or not alone, for Gaia was with him, and the weight of rightness was with him, and the imprisoned ones in their darkness were with him in spirit, if not in body. But he would be the only one to raise his hand, the only one to strike, the only one to bear the burden of what came next. He waited for the right moment, not with impatience, but with the patience he had learned from his mother, the patience of stone, the patience of mountains, rising grain by grain from the sea floor. He waited as Uranus descended once again to embrace Gaia, as the sky pressed down upon the earth in that ancient rhythm of union that had created all the titans, all the imprisoned ones, all the beings that populated the narrow space between ground and heaven. And when Uranus was close, when the sky had descended as far as it could descend, when there was no space left between above and below, Cronus emerged from his hiding place. He moved not with violence but with certainty, not with rage but with resolve. He raised the sickle that his mother had made, that great curved blade of adamant, and he struck. It was not a blow of hatred. It was not an act of murder. It was something else, something more primal and more necessary. It was the cutting of a cord that had become a noose. It was the severing of a connection that had become a prison. It was the separation of things that had been too close, too entangled, too compressed together. The sickle cut through the space where earth and sky joined, through the place where Uranus's power manifested, through the source of his ability to press down and confine and imprison. And in that cutting, the world changed. Uranus cried out, but his cry was not like the cry of a mortal being. It was the sound of wind rushing into a vacuum, of thunder rolling across an empty plain, of stars suddenly shifting in their courses. It was the sound of inevitability, of change that cannot be stopped, of the universe rearranging itself into a new configuration. And he began to rise. Not fleeing, exactly, not retreating in fear or defeat, but rising as if released, as if the cutting had freed him as much as it had freed the earth below. He rose higher and higher, the vast expanse of his being stretching upward, pulling away from Gaia's surface, creating space where there had been no space, opening distance where there had been only compression. The stars that had been so close you could almost touch them suddenly receded, becoming distant points of light in an infinite darkness. The weight that had pressed down upon the world lifted, and for the first time there was room to breathe, room to grow, room for things to unfold into their true shapes and sizes. Gaia felt this separation like the release of a breath she had been holding for eons. She felt her surface expand, her mountains rise higher, her valleys deepen, her plains spread wider. She felt space opening within her as well, as if the cutting had freed something in her depths, as if her imprisoned children might now have room to move, to stretch, to hope for eventual release. And from the place where the sickle had struck, from the severing of sky from earth, new things began to emerge. Drops of Uranus's essence fell toward the earth, each one carrying within it the potential for new life, new forms, new beings. Some fell upon Gaia's surface and sank into her soil, planting themselves like seeds that would one day grow into strange and powerful creatures. Some fell into the waters that Oceanus had spread around the world's edge, and the sea began to foam and churn with the promise of what would emerge from those depths. But these new beings were not yet fully formed. They were still becoming, still taking shape in the hidden places of earth and sea. Their stories would unfold in time, in the proper sequence, in the natural rhythm of creation that could not be rushed. For now, there was simply the separation. The sky above, higher and more distant than before, still beautiful, still vast, but no longer oppressive. The earth below, broader and deeper than before, still solid, still patient, but no longer confined. And between them space, precious, necessary space. Room for the world to breathe and grow and become what it was meant to be. Cronus stood upon his mother's surface, still holding the sickle, feeling its weight, feeling the weight of what he had done. He had acted against his father. He had changed the fundamental structure of the cosmos. He had set in motion events that could not be undone, consequences that would ripple forward through all of time. But he had also freed the world. He had created space for growth, for change, for the unfolding of new possibilities. He had answered his mother's pain with action, had responded to injustice with courage, had dared to imagine that things could be different, and then made them so. The other titans emerged from where they had hidden, watching the sky recede, feeling the new spaciousness around them. They looked at Cronus with expressions that mixed awe and fear, gratitude and uncertainty. They had not helped him, but they would benefit from what he had done. They had not dared to act, but they would live in the world his action had created. And deep below, in the darkness of Tartarus, the imprisoned ones stirred. They felt the change, felt the shifting of the earth above them, felt the possibility that perhaps, one day, they too might be freed. The Cyclopes opened their single eyes a little wider. The Hecatonchires uncurled their 100 arms slightly, testing the space around them. They did not yet know what would come, but they knew that something had changed, that the world above was different, that their long waiting might not be endless after all. Gaia rested in her new freedom, feeling the space above her, feeling her children walking upon her surface with more room to move, feeling the seeds of new beings taking root in her soil and in the surrounding seas. She had asked for change, and change had come. She had called for justice, and justice had been served, though not without cost, not without consequences that would echo through the ages. The world was different now. The age of Uranus's rule was over, though he still existed, still stretched across the heavens, still wheeled his stars through the darkness. But he was distant now, separate, no longer the oppressive presence he had been. And in his place, in the space he had left behind, a new order would emerge. And so the sickles sang in the silence, and the world was no longer the same. Above and below, distance opened, and in between, the space for stories yet to come. In the aftermath of the great separation, the world learned to breathe. It was a slow breath, deep and ancient, like the first inhalation of a being who has been held underwater and finally breaks the surface. The earth expanded, her mountains stretching upward with more freedom, her valleys sinking deeper into themselves, her plains rolling outward like blankets being smoothed across an endless bed. And above, the sky receded into distances that seemed to have no limit, pulling back and back until the stars that had once hung close enough to touch became distant points of light, cold and remote and beautiful in their farness. Between earth and sky, there was space now. Precious, luminous space, the kind of space that allows things to move, to change, to become what they are meant to become. It was like the space between breaths, between heartbeats, between one wave and the next as they roll endlessly toward shore. It was emptiness, but it was not empty. It was filled with possibility, with potential, with the quiet hum of a universe learning its own song. Gaia felt this new spaciousness in every part of herself. Her rivers, which had flowed in narrow channels pressed between earth and sky, now spread wider, carving deeper beds, finding their own paths through the landscape. They moved with a new freedom, meandering through valleys, pooling in low places to form the first lakes, rushing down mountainsides in cascades that caught what little light there was and turned it into silver. The seas, too, began to change. Oceanus, that great river that encircled the world, felt his waters deepen and expand. Where before he had been a shallow stream pressed against the earth's edge, he now became a true ocean, vast and profound, his depths extending down and down into darkness that even he could not fully fathom. His waters grew restless with their new freedom, rising and falling in the first tides, moved by forces that were still learning their rhythm, still finding their pattern. And in the new space above, the winds were born. They had not existed before, or if they had existed, they had been too compressed to move, too confined to flow. But now they stirred, gentle at first, like the breath of a sleeping giant, moving across Gaia's surface, touching the peaks of mountains, rippling across the surfaces of new, formed lakes, carrying with them the scent of stone and water and the peculiar freshness of a world still young. Hyperion, the Titan of light, felt the change most profoundly. With space to shine, his light grew stronger, brighter, spreading further across the world. It was still not the brilliant light of the sun that would one day blaze across the sky, but it was more than it had been. A gentle radiance that touched the edges of things, that created the first true shadows, that made it possible to see depth and distance, and the subtle variations in the landscape that had always been there, but had been invisible in the compressed dimness of before. And Cronus stood at the center of this transformed world, the great sickle still in his hands, its curved blade catching Hyperion's light and reflecting it back in shades of grey and silver. The other titans gathered around him, not too close, keeping a respectful distance, their eyes upon him with expressions that were difficult to read in the uncertain light. They looked at him with awe, for he had done what none of them had dared to do. He had changed the fundamental nature of existence. He had severed the bond between earth and sky, had pushed back the oppressive weight of their father's presence, had created the space in which they now stood. They were grateful, in their way, for the freedom he had won for them, for the room to move and grow, and explore their own natures without the constant pressure of Uranus pressing down from above. But they also looked at him with unease, with a wariness that they tried to hide, but could not entirely suppress. For he had raised his hand against his father. He had wielded a weapon against the one who had given him life. He had proven that even the most fundamental structures of the cosmos could be changed, could be cut away, could be transformed by an act of will and a blade sharp enough to sever what seemed eternal. If he could do that to Uranus, what might he do to them? If he could change the world so completely, so irrevocably, what other changes might he envision? What other transformations might he decide were necessary? Cronus felt their eyes upon him, felt the weight of their attention, their judgment, their fear. He understood it. He did not resent it. He had known, when he took up the sickle, when he made his decision, that he would be changed by what he did, that he would become something different in the eyes of his siblings, in the eyes of the world, perhaps even in his own eyes. He had been the youngest, the last born, the one who came after all the others. Now he was something else. The one who had acted, the one who had dared, the one who held in his hands the power to cut and change and reshape reality itself. And slowly, without anyone quite deciding it, without any formal declaration or ceremony, the other Titans began to defer to him. When they had questions about how to navigate this new world, they came to Cronus. When they were uncertain about what should be done, they looked to him for guidance. When they gathered together to discuss the future, he stood at the center, and the others arranged themselves around him like planets around a sun that had not yet been born. He did not seek this position. He did not demand it or claim it as a right. It simply happened, the way water flows downhill, the way stones settle into their natural places, the way the world organizes itself according to principles that run deeper than thought or intention. And Cronus, who had acted out of justice, out of a desire to free his imprisoned siblings and give the world room to breathe, found himself becoming a ruler. Not through conquest or force, but through the simple fact of having changed everything, of having proven that change was possible, of holding in his hands the instrument that had made that change real. But even as this new order was taking shape among the Titans, other changes were unfolding in the hidden places of the world, in the soil and the sea, in the spaces between things where transformation happens slowly and quietly, like seeds germinating in darkness. Where the sickle had struck, where Uranus's essence had been severed and had fallen toward the earth, new beings were beginning to form. They emerged not all at once, but gradually, the way flowers emerge from buds, the way butterflies emerge from chrysalises, the way dawn emerges from night. Some of the drops had fallen upon Gaia's surface, sinking into her soil, mixing with her substance, taking root in the deep places where stone becomes earth and earth becomes life. From these drops, the first giants began to stir, beings of immense size and strength, born from the union of sky, essence and earth matter, partaking of both natures, belonging fully to neither. They were not yet fully formed, not yet ready to walk upon the world's surface. They gestated in the darkness of Gaia's depths, growing slowly, their forms taking shape grain by grain, cell by cell, like mountains rising from the sea floor over ages too long to measure. They would emerge in time, when the world was ready for them, when their moment had come. For now, they were only potential, only promise, only the faint trembling in the earth that suggested something vast was growing below. From the same sky, essence, from drops that fell in different places, other beings emerged more quickly. The Malaya, the nymphs of the ash trees, rose from the soil like saplings, their forms slender and graceful, their skin the color of bark, their hair like leaves that rustled in the new, born winds. They were spirits of growth and resilience, embodiments of the life force that allows trees to bend without breaking, to weather storms and seasons, to sink roots deep and reach branches high. They scattered across Gaia's surface, and where they walked, ash trees began to grow, the first true forests spreading across the landscape, their leaves whispering secrets to the wind, their roots drinking deep from hidden springs, their wood strong and flexible, perfect for making tools and weapons in ages yet to come. And from the same source, from the same severing, came beings of a different nature entirely. The Erinyes, 3 sisters born from violence but devoted to justice, emerged from the blood-soaked earth like smoke rising from a fire. They were called Alecto, Megara, and Tisiphone, and their forms were both beautiful and terrible, shifting between maiden and crone, between mercy and vengeance, between the gentle reminder of conscience and the relentless pursuit of those who break the fundamental laws. They were not monsters, though they would be called monstrous by those who feared them. They were necessary. They were the universe's response to wrongdoing, the balance that ensures no crime goes unanswered, no injustice stands forever. They were born from the act of a son against a father, and they would forever after concern themselves with such matters, with the bonds of family, with the obligations of blood, with the terrible consequences that follow when those bonds are broken. But they were not cruel. They were not arbitrary. They were simply inevitable, like the turning of seasons, like the falling of night after day, like the way all debts must eventually be paid and all accounts must eventually balance. They rose from the earth and took their place in the world, watching, waiting, their eyes seeing everything, their memories perfect and unforgiving, their purpose clear and unchangeable. And the Titans, seeing them, felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature, a recognition that the world now contained within it the seeds of justice and consequence. That actions would have weight, that choices would matter in ways they had not mattered before. But the most remarkable transformation was happening far from land, out in the deep waters where Oceanus flowed around the world's edge, where some of Uranus's essence had fallen not upon earth, but into the sea. The water there began to foam and churn, not with violence, but with a kind of creative turbulence, like milk being stirred, like clouds forming in a clear sky. The foam was white and luminous, catching what light there was and reflecting it back in shades of pearl and silver, and the pale pink of shells washed up on beaches that did not yet exist. And within that foam, something was forming, something delicate and beautiful, something that partook of both the sky's distant majesty and the sea's deep mystery. It was not yet complete, not yet ready to emerge. It would take time, this creation, longer than the giants in their earth, wombs, longer than the Erinyes in their blood birth, longer than the Malae in their soil, sprouting. But it was there, growing in the sea, foam, nurtured by the waves, shaped by the tides, becoming something that would one day change the world, as profoundly as Cronus's sickle had changed it, though in a completely different way. Something that would bring not separation but connection, not cutting but joining, not the sharp edge of change, but the soft pull of desire and beauty and love. But that emergence was still to come, still waiting in the future like a promise whispered by the waves. For now, there was only the foam, only the gentle churning of the sea, only the sense that something precious was being created in the hidden depths, something that would be worth the waiting. And as these new beings took their places in the world, as the giants grew in Earth's darkness, and the Erinyes walked in Earth's shadows, and the Malae danced among their ash trees and the sea, foam swirled with its secret creation. Time itself began to change. It had been flowing before, yes, but without rhythm, without pattern, without the sense of cycles and seasons that would give it meaning and structure. But now, with space to move, with room to breathe, with the separation of earth and sky, creating the possibility of perspective and change, time began to organize itself into something more complex, more beautiful, more like the time that mortals would one day know and measure and fear and treasure. The light that Hyperion provided began to vary, growing slightly brighter and then dimmer, creating the first hint of what would become day and night. Though they were not yet distinct, not yet clearly separated, more like the slow breathing of the world, the gentle rhythm of inhalation and exhalation. The winds that moved across Gaia's surface began to follow patterns, blowing from certain directions at certain times, carrying warmth or coolness, moisture or dryness, creating the first subtle variations in the world's climate, the first suggestions of what would one day be called seasons. The tides in Oceanus's waters rose and fell with increasing regularity, pulled by forces that were still mysterious, still not fully understood, but undeniably present, undeniably real, creating a rhythm that echoed the rhythm of time itself, the endless cycle of rising and falling, coming and going, presence and absence. And the Titans, walking through this transformed world, began to understand their own natures more fully, began to explore the powers and purposes that had been compressed and confined before, but were now free to unfold and express themselves. Oceanus let his waters deepen and spread, discovering the joy of vastness, of depths that went down and down into darkness, of surfaces that stretched to horizons that seemed to have no end. Coeus turned on his axis and felt the world turning with him, felt the stars wheeling overhead in their great dance, felt the rhythm of rotation that would one day measure days and years and ages. Hyperion's light grew stronger and more confident, learning to shine, learning to illuminate, learning to reveal the beauty and complexity of the world that had been hidden in dimness. Themis walked the earth and began to perceive the laws that governed it, the principles of balance and proportion and rightness that ran through everything like threads through a tapestry. Mnemosyne remembered all that had happened and began to understand that memory itself was a kind of power, that to hold the past was to shape the future, that nothing was ever truly lost if it could be remembered. And Rhea, gentle Rhea, who had been quiet through all the upheaval, who had watched her youngest brother act while she and her other siblings hesitated, began to feel something stirring within herself. A sense of potential, of possibility, of futures waiting to unfold. She walked beside rivers and felt their flow as something alive, something purposeful, something that moved toward destinations it had not yet reached, but somehow knew were waiting. She looked at Cronus, who stood at the center of the new order, who held the sickle that had changed everything, and she felt something complex and difficult to name. Admiration for his courage, concern for his burden, curiosity about what he would become, what they would all become, in this world that was still taking shape, still learning its own nature, still unfolding like a flower that has just begun to open its petals to the light. The world was not yet finished. It would never be finished, for that is the nature of existence, to always be becoming, always be changing, always be moving towards something new. But it was more itself now than it had been before. It had room to breathe, room to grow, room to contain multitudes. The stars wheeled overhead in their distant courses, cold and beautiful and indifferent. The earth spread below, warm and patient and endlessly generative. And between them, in that precious space that had been won by courage and sacrifice, and the sharp edge of an adamant blade, the world continued its slow unfolding, one breath, one wave, one heartbeat at a time, carrying within itself the seeds of all that was to come, all the stories that would be told, all the beings that would be born. And in the silence that followed, the sea breathed, the earth dreamed, and the stars turned slowly above. The story was not finished. It was only beginning. There came a time, after the great separation, after the sky had risen, and the earth had spread, and the space between them had filled with wind and light and possibility, when the world settled into a kind of peace. It was not the peace of emptiness, nor the peace of endings, but the peace of things finding their natural places, like stones settling into a riverbed, like stars finding their positions in the great wheel of the heavens, like breath falling into its easy rhythm after exertion. This was the age that would later be called golden, though gold itself did not yet exist, though the metals slept still in the earth's deep veins, waiting for hands that had not yet been formed to dig them out and shape them into beauty and utility and ornament. But golden it was, in the way that certain light is golden, the way late afternoon sun slants through leaves and turns everything it touches into something precious, something worth remembering, something that glows with a warmth that seems to come from within rather than from without. The world in this age was simpler than it would become. There were no mortals yet, no humans with their brief bright lives and their endless questions and their capacity for both creation and destruction. There were no cities, no roads, no fields planted and harvested, no flocks grazing on hillsides, no smoke rising from hearth fires in the evening. There was only the earth and the sky, and the beings who moved between them, the titans and the spirits, and the strange new creatures that had been born from the separation, all of them learning to exist in this expanded world, all of them finding their rhythms and their purposes. The forests spread across Gaia's surface like green thoughts, the Malaya dancing among their ash trees, their laughter like wind through branches, their footsteps so light they left no trace on the forest floor. Other trees grew as well, oaks and pines and willows, rising from the soil without being planted, finding their places according to principles that had nothing to do with human intention, everything to do with the deep intelligence of the earth itself, which knew where each tree should stand, where each root should reach, where each branch should extend toward the light. The rivers flowed in their courses, carving the landscape gently, patiently, the way water shapes stone over ages too long to count. They were not hurried, these rivers. They had nowhere to be except where they were, no destination except the sea, and the sea was patient, was always waiting, would wait forever if necessary. They meandered through valleys, pooled in quiet places where fish that had somehow come into being swam in slow circles, their scales catching the light, their movements hypnotic and purposeless and perfect, and the light itself, Hyperion's gift to the world, began to take on qualities it had not possessed before. It learned to be golden in the hours that would come to be called morning and evening, when it slanted across the world at angles that made everything seem softer, more forgiving, more beautiful. It learned to be silver at other times, cooler and clearer, revealing details and distances with a precision that the golden light preferred to blur. It learned to vary, to change, to create the rhythm of brightness and dimness that would eventually become the cycle of day and night, though that cycle was still gentle, still gradual, more like breathing than like the sharp division between light and dark that mortals would one day know. The winds, too, found their patterns. They blew from the directions that would later be named north and south, east and west, though those names did not yet exist, though direction itself was still a new concept in a world that had once been too compressed for anything to have a direction, for everything to be pressed together in an eternal, suffocating now. The winds carried scents and seeds, moisture and warmth, coolness and dryness. They were the world's breath, the invisible force that connected everything, that touched the mountain peaks and the river valleys, the forest canopies and the ocean surfaces, binding it all together in a web of moving air. And slowly, so slowly that it was barely perceptible, the seasons began to form. Not the sharp seasons that would come later, with their harsh winters and blazing summers, their dramatic transitions and their clear boundaries. These were gentler, subtler, more like moods than like distinct periods of time. There were times when the world felt slightly warmer, when the light lingered a bit longer, when the plants grew with a particular enthusiasm, when the rivers swelled with water from sources that were still mysterious. And there were times when the world felt slightly cooler, when the light withdrew a bit earlier, when the plants rested, when the rivers retreated into themselves, flowing more quietly, more slowly, conserving their strength for the next cycle of growth. Nothing struggled in this age. Nothing suffered. The plants grew without effort, without the need for cultivation or care. The animals that had begun to appear, deer moving like shadows through the forests, birds whose songs had no audience but themselves, fish in the rivers and strange creatures in the sea. All of them found food easily, found shelter naturally, lived and died without pain, without fear, without the desperate urgency that would characterize life in later ages. It was a world in balance, a world in harmony, a world that seemed to have found a stable configuration, a way of being that could continue indefinitely, that could last forever, that could remain golden, and peaceful and perfect for all of time. And at the center of this golden world stood Cronus. He did not stand in any particular place, for his presence was everywhere, like a mountain is everywhere in the landscape around it, like a shadow is everywhere when the sun is high. He was the ruler of the Titans, though he had not claimed that title, though it had simply settled upon him like dust settles on surfaces, like dew settles on grass in the hours before dawn. His siblings deferred to him, looked to him, arranged themselves in relation to him, not because he demanded it, but because the world seemed to require it, because someone had to stand at the center, and he was the one who had changed everything, who had made this golden age possible. He still carried the sickle. It was always with him, that great curved blade of adamant, grey and cold and heavy with purpose, but he rarely held it in his hands anymore. More often it rested nearby, leaning against a stone or lying in the grass, close enough to reach if needed, but not needed, not in this peaceful age, not in this time of harmony and balance. It was a symbol now more than a tool, a reminder of what he had done, of what he was capable of doing, of the power he possessed to cut and change and reshape reality. The other Titans saw it and remembered. They saw it and felt gratitude for the freedom it had won them. They saw it and felt unease at the violence it represented, at the proof it offered that even the most fundamental structures could be severed, that even fathers could be overthrown, that even the eternal could end. Oceanus, the eldest, flowed around the world's edge and kept his thoughts to himself, his deep waters hiding whatever he felt about his youngest brother's ascension. Coeus turned on his axis and contemplated the new order from all angles, finding it acceptable, finding it stable, but always aware that stability is not the same as permanence, that what has been changed once can be changed again. Crius studied the stars and saw patterns there, cycles within cycles, repetitions that suggested the universe had a memory, that it remembered its own history and might be inclined to repeat it. Hyperion shone his light across the world and was content, for he had more space to shine now, more room to illuminate. But sometimes his light caught the edge of the sickle and reflected back in a way that made him uncomfortable, that reminded him of the moment when everything changed. Iapetus understood endings, and he looked at Cronus and saw not just a beginning, but the seeds of an ending, the way all things that rise must eventually fall, the way all power contains within it the mechanism of its own undoing. But he said nothing, for what would be the point? The future would unfold as it would unfold, and speaking of it would not change it, would only disturb the golden peace that everyone else seemed to be enjoying. And Themis, who perceived the laws of balance and justice, walked through the world and felt its harmony, felt the rightness of things as they were, but also felt something else, something harder to name. A tension, perhaps. A fragility. The sense that this balance was not self-sustaining, that it required constant, invisible adjustments, that it was like a stone balanced on its point, stable for the moment but requiring perfect conditions to remain so, vulnerable to the slightest disturbance. She looked at Cronus and saw a ruler who governed by presence rather than by action, who held power but did not wield it, who stood at the center of the world like an axis around which everything else turned. She saw strength in him, and courage, and a kind of grim determination. But she also saw doubt, though he tried to hide it, though he wore his authority like a cloak that covered everything beneath. And Mnemosyne, who remembered everything, who could not forget even if she wanted to, who carried within her mind the complete record, of all that had happened since the beginning. She remembered most of all. She remembered the darkness before Gaia and Uranus, the compression of the early world, the imprisonment of the Cyclopes and the Hecatonchires, the moment when Cronus raised the sickle, the sound of the cutting, the cry of Uranus as he rose into the distant sky. She remembered all of it with perfect clarity, and she could not help but see patterns in what she remembered. She could not help but notice that Uranus had feared his children and had imprisoned them, and that Cronus had overthrown Uranus to free them, and that now Cronus ruled in Uranus's place. She could not help but wonder if the cycle was complete, or if it was only beginning, if what had happened once might happen again, if the son who overthrows the father might one day be overthrown by his own son in turn. She kept these thoughts to herself, for they were not pleasant thoughts, not thoughts suited to a golden age, not thoughts that anyone wanted to hear. But she remembered them, as she remembered everything, and they weighed on her like stones, like the weight of all history pressing down on the present moment. And Gaia, the earth herself, dreamed in her deep places. She dreamed of things that had been and things that would be, of cycles and seasons, and the great wheel of time that turned and brought everything around again. She had asked Cronus to act, had given him the sickle, had set in motion the events that had led to this golden age. She did not regret it. Her imprisoned children still waited in Tartarus, but the world above was freer, was more spacious, was more alive with possibility. But she also felt, in the way that the earth feels things, in the slow, deep knowing that comes from being the foundation of everything, that this peace was temporary, that this balance was fragile, that the golden age would not last forever. Nothing lasted forever. That was the nature of existence, the fundamental law that governed all things. Everything that began would end. Everything that rose would fall. Everything that was born would die, or change, or transform into something else. She did not speak these thoughts aloud, for she had no mouth to speak with, no voice except the voice of earthquakes, and the whisper of wind through grass, and the slow grinding of stone against stone in her depths. But she knew them, and knowing them, she waited, as the earth always waits, patient and eternal and aware that time moves differently for her than it does for the beings who walk upon her surface. And Cronus, standing at the center of the golden world, felt the weight of his position, the burden of his power, the responsibility of his rule. He had acted out of justice, out of a desire to free his imprisoned siblings, out of a need to create space for the world to breathe. And he had succeeded. The world was freer now, was more beautiful, was more alive with possibility than it had ever been. But he could not forget what he had done to achieve this. He could not forget the moment when he raised the sickle, when he struck his father, when he severed sky from earth and changed everything forever. He had acted against the one who gave him life, had raised his hand against his own father, had committed an act that seemed to violate something fundamental, something sacred, something that should not be violated no matter how just the cause. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, when the world was still and the light was golden and everything seemed perfect, he felt the echo of that act reverberating through him. He felt the weight of it, the consequences of it, the way it had changed not just the world but himself, had made him into something he had not been before, something he was not entirely sure he wanted to be. He thought about Uranus, distant now in the high heavens, separated from Gaia, unable to oppress or confine or imprison. Was his father suffering? Did he feel pain in his separation? Did he resent what had been done to him? Did he plot revenge? Or had he accepted his new position? Had he found peace in the distance, in the freedom from the burden of ruling, in the simplicity of being sky and nothing more? Cronus did not know, and there was no way to know, for Uranus did not speak, did not send messages, did not reach down from his distant heights to communicate with the world below. He simply existed, vast and remote and silent, wheeling his stars through the darkness, marking time with his movements, present but absent, there but not there, like a memory that refuses to fade, but also refuses to be fully present. And sometimes, in those quiet moments, Cronus looked at the sickle, that great curved blade that had changed everything, and he wondered. He wondered if what he had done to his father might one day be done to him. He wondered if there was a pattern here, a cycle, a repetition that the universe seemed to favor. He wondered if he too might one day face a child who saw him as an obstacle, as an oppressor, as something that needed to be cut away so that the world could move forward. He had not yet married. He had not yet had children. The thought of children filled him with a complex mixture of desire and dread. He wanted to continue, wanted to create, wanted to bring new beings into this golden world and watch them grow and flourish. But he also feared them, feared what they might become, feared that they might be stronger than him, might be more ambitious, might see in him what he had seen in Uranus, a ruler who had served his purpose, but who now stood in the way of the next transformation, the next change, the next turning of the great wheel. These thoughts troubled him, but he pushed them down, buried them deep, tried to focus on the present moment, on the golden world around him, on the peace and harmony that he had helped to create. There was time, he told himself. There was no need to worry about the future when the present was so perfect, so balanced, so beautiful in its stillness. But the thoughts remained, like seeds buried in soil, waiting for the right conditions to sprout, to grow, to break through the surface, and reveal themselves in forms that could not be ignored. The world rested in its golden age, and everything seemed perfect, seemed stable, seemed as if it could continue forever. The rivers flowed gently through their valleys, catching the light and reflecting it back in shades of silver and gold. The forests whispered in the wind, their leaves rustling with secrets that no one could quite hear. The mountains stood patient and eternal, their peaks touching the distant sky, their roots sinking deep into Gaia's depths. The light slanted across the landscape, in that particular way that makes everything seem precious, that makes every moment feel like it should be remembered, that makes the present feel both eternal and fleeting, both permanent and impossibly fragile. The winds carried scents of growing things, of water and stone, and the peculiar freshness of a world that was still young, still learning itself, still unfolding into its full potential. And beneath it all, beneath the beauty and the peace and the golden stillness, there was something else. Not visible, not audible, not tangible in any way that could be measured or described, but present nonetheless. A tension, perhaps, a waiting, a sense that this moment, perfect as it was not an ending but an interlude, not a destination but a pause in a longer journey, not a conclusion but a question waiting for its answer. Mnemosyne felt it in her memories, in the patterns she could not help but see. Themis felt it in her perception of balance, in her understanding that all scales eventually tip, that all equilibriums are temporary. Gaia felt it in her depths, in the slow dreaming that was her form of thought, in the ancient knowing that came from being the foundation of everything. And Cronus felt it in the weight of the sickle, in the echo of what he had done, in the fear that what goes around comes around, that the wheel turns, that the cycle repeats. But none of them spoke of it. Not yet. For the world was golden, and the light was beautiful, and the rivers flowed gently, and the forests whispered their secrets, and everything seemed perfect, seemed balanced, seemed as if it could last forever, even though nothing lasts forever, even though all things change, even though the universe itself is nothing but transformation, nothing but the endless dance of creation and destruction, of rising and falling, of beginning and ending and beginning again. The sky above glowed with the soft colours of what might have been dusk, though dusk and dawn were not yet clearly distinguished, were still learning their differences, were still finding their places in the rhythm of time. Gold and rose and the palest blue blended together in the heights where Uranus wheeled his distant stars, where the separation between earth and sky was most visible, most profound, most complete. The rivers caught that light and held it, their surfaces glowing as if lit from within, as if the water itself had learned to shine, had learned to be beautiful, had learned to reflect not just the light that fell upon it, but some deeper light, some inner radiance that came from being part of this golden world. This perfect moment, this fragile balance, and the winds, those invisible messengers, those carriers of scent and seed and moisture and change, moved across the landscape carrying whispers that no one yet understood, carrying messages that had not yet been written, carrying the future in their invisible hands, bringing it closer with every breath, with every gust, with every gentle touch against skin and leaf and stone. The world rested, but the silence carried within it a question, waiting for its answer in time. The golden age continued, turning like a wheel that moves so smoothly it seems not to move at all, like water flowing so gently it appears to be still. Days passed, though days were not yet counted, not yet measured, not yet divided into the precise units that mortals would one day use to mark their brief passage through the world. Time flowed like honey, thick and slow and sweet, and the world remained suspended in its perfect balance, its fragile harmony, its beautiful stillness. But nothing, not even perfection, remains unchanged forever. The first tremor in the golden stillness came not from outside, but from within, not from any external threat, but from the nature of consciousness itself, from the way that minds, even the minds of titans, cannot help but think, cannot help but question, cannot help but look forward into the uncertain future and see shadows gathering there, possibilities that disturb the peace of the present moment. Cronus felt it first, or perhaps he had been feeling it all along, had been carrying it within him since the moment he raised the sickle against his father, since the moment he cut sky from earth and changed the fundamental nature of existence. It was a weight that grew heavier with each passing cycle of light and dimness, each turning of the seasons, each gentle breath of wind across the golden meadows. He would stand sometimes at the edge of high places, looking out across the world he ruled, and the beauty of it would fill him with something that was not quite joy, not quite satisfaction, but something more complex, more troubled. He saw the forests spreading in their green abundance, the rivers flowing in their peaceful courses, the mountains standing eternal against the sky. He saw his siblings moving through the landscape, each pursuing their own nature, each content in their own way. He saw harmony, saw balance, saw the fulfillment of what he had fought to achieve, but he also saw fragility. He saw how easily it could all be disrupted, how thin the membrane was between peace and chaos, between order and upheaval. He saw how he himself had been the instrument of such disruption, how he had shattered the old order to create this new one, and the knowledge of his own capacity for transformation haunted him like a shadow that grows longer as the sun descends toward evening. And there was something else, something that came to him in the quiet moments, in the spaces between thoughts, in the stillness just before sleep claimed him. A whisper, perhaps. A knowing. A sense that the universe itself was trying to tell him something, that the patterns he had set in motion were not yet complete, that the story that had begun with his act of rebellion was not yet finished, that there were more chapters to come, more turnings of the wheel, more changes that would reshape everything once again. He tried to ignore these feelings, tried to focus on the present, on the golden world around him, on the responsibilities of rule and the maintenance of harmony. But they persisted, like a low note humming beneath music, like a current moving deep beneath the surface of a calm sea, invisible but present, always present, pulling at him, troubling him, refusing to be dismissed. And then Rhea came to him, gentle Rhea, who moved through the world like water moves through channels, finding her path naturally, flowing around obstacles, nourishing everything she touched. She had been watching him, had seen the weight he carried, had felt the tension in him, even as he tried to project strength and certainty and control. They walked together through meadows that glowed in the golden light, through forests where the Malaya sang their wordless songs, along rivers that murmured their endless conversations with the stones that shaped their beds. And as they walked, something grew between them, something that had perhaps always been there, but was only now being acknowledged, only now being allowed to take form and substance. It was not the wild, disruptive force that would one day emerge from the sea. Foam, not the overwhelming passion that would characterize the goddess still forming in those distant waters. It was quieter than that, gentler, more like the way rivers flow together, the way roots intertwine beneath the soil, the way dawn light gradually fills the sky without announcement or drama. They became partners, became companions, became something that the world had not yet seen. A union of equals, a joining that was about more than power, or dynasty, or the continuation of bloodlines, though it would become about those things too, in time. For now, it was simply two beings finding comfort in each other's presence, finding in each other a respite from the weight of existence, from the burden of consciousness, from the loneliness that comes from being ancient and powerful and aware of the vast indifference of the cosmos. And in time, as the Golden Age continued its slow turning, Rhea felt within herself the stirring of new life, the beginning of something that would change everything, though she did not yet know how completely, how irrevocably, how profoundly the children she would bear would reshape the world and all the ages to come. The first child was born in a time that felt like spring, though spring was still a new concept, still learning its nature, still discovering what it meant to be the season of beginnings. The birth was quiet, without the drama that would attend later births, later arrivals into the world. One moment there was only Rhea, and then there was Rhea and another, a daughter, a being of such grace and dignity that even the newborn seemed ancient, seemed to carry within her an understanding of order and proper conduct and the right way of things. They named her Hestia, and she was the first of what would come to be called the Olympians. Though Olympus itself did not yet exist, was not yet the seat of power it would become, was still just another mountain among mountains, no more significant than any other peak that touched the distant sky. Cronus looked at his daughter and felt a surge of emotions so complex he could not name them all. Pride, certainly. Wonder at the miracle of new life, at the way consciousness could create more consciousness, at the way existence perpetuated itself through generation after generation. Love, fierce and immediate and unconditional, the kind of love that would do anything to protect, to nurture, to ensure the safety and flourishing of this small, perfect being. But also fear, deep, cold, undeniable fear, because looking at Hestia, he saw potential. He saw power waiting to unfold, strength that would grow with time, capability that might one day rival or exceed his own. He saw the future, and in the future he saw the possibility of repetition, of the cycle continuing, of the pattern that had begun with Uranus and himself playing out again with himself and his children. He said nothing of this fear. He held his daughter and smiled and played the role of proud father, of protective parent, of ruler welcoming the next generation. But the fear remained, a seed planted deep, waiting for the right conditions to grow. And Rhea, who knew him better than anyone, who could read the subtle tensions in his body, the shadows that passed across his face when he thought no one was watching, felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature, a premonition that something was not right, that the golden age was beginning to tarnish at its edges, that the perfect balance was starting to tip. But she too said nothing. What could she say? What words could address fears that were still formless, still undefined, still hiding in the spaces between thoughts? So she held her daughter and nursed her, and watched her grow, and tried not to think about the way Cronus sometimes looked at Hestia, with an expression that mixed love and fear in proportions, that shifted like shadows, like clouds passing across the face of the sun. Time continued its flow, and another child was born, and then another. Demeter came next, a daughter who seemed to carry within her the essence of growth itself, of seeds sprouting and plants reaching toward light, of the generous abundance of the earth. And then Hera, regal even as an infant, possessing a natural authority that suggested she would one day command respect and deference from all who encountered her. With each birth, Cronus's joy grew, and his fear grew with it, the two emotions intertwined like vines, impossible to separate, feeding off each other, creating a tension that he carried in his shoulders, in his jaw, in the way he gripped the sickle that was never far from his side. He began to have dreams, though dreams were still a new phenomenon, still strange and unsettling to beings who had existed for so long in a state of constant wakefulness. In these dreams, he saw himself as Uranus had been, distant and diminished, pushed aside by children who had grown strong enough to challenge him, who had decided that his time was over, that the world needed new rulers, new perspectives, new powers to guide it into whatever came next. He would wake from these dreams with his heart racing, with the taste of fear in his mouth, with the certainty that they were not just dreams but prophecies, not just random images conjured by a sleeping mind, but glimpses of a future that was already written, already inevitable, already moving toward him like a wave that had been set in motion long ago and could not be stopped. And one night, after waking from such a dream, he went to Gaia, to the earth herself, seeking counsel, seeking reassurance, seeking some way to escape the fate that seemed to be closing around him like a trap. He stood in a place where the earth's presence was particularly strong, where her consciousness rose close to the surface, where it was possible to speak to her and be heard, to ask questions and receive answers, though the answers were often cryptic, often difficult to interpret, often more troubling than comforting. "Mother," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might make his fears more real, might give them substance and power. "Tell me what you see. Tell me what the future holds." And Gaia, who dreamed in her depths, who knew things that even the Titans did not know, who remembered the beginning and could sense the shape of what was to come, answered him. Not with words, for she had no mouth, no voice in the way that other beings had voices, but with knowing, with images that formed in his mind, with certainties that settled into his consciousness like stones sinking into water. She showed him a future where his children grew strong, grew powerful, grew ambitious. She showed him a son, not yet born, who would be like him, who would have his strength and his courage, and his willingness to act when others hesitated. She showed him the pattern repeating, the cycle continuing, the wheel turning once more, bringing everything around again. "Will they overthrow me?" he asked, though he already knew the answer, could feel it in the weight of the images she had placed in his mind. "Will they do to me what I did to my father?" And Gaia's answer was not yes or no, not a simple declaration of fate or fortune. It was more complex than that, more nuanced, more true to the way the universe actually worked. She showed him possibilities, potentials, paths that might be taken or might be avoided, futures that were probable but not certain, outcomes that depended on choices not yet made, on actions not yet taken. But the overall message was clear: the danger was real, the pattern was strong, the cycle wanted to repeat. And if he did nothing, if he simply continued as he had been, ruling his golden age, and hoping that the future would be different from the past, then yes, his children would likely rise against him, would likely see him as an obstacle to be overcome, would likely do to him what he had done to Uranus. He left that place feeling heavier than when he had arrived, feeling the weight of prophecy pressing down on him, feeling the future closing in like walls narrowing, like options disappearing, like paths being cut off one by one until only a few remained, and none of them good, none of them easy, none of them free from pain and loss, and the kind of choices that change who you are, that make you into something you never wanted to become. The Golden Age continued, but it was different now, at least for Cronus. The light still slanted beautifully across the meadows, the rivers still flowed in their gentle courses, the forests still whispered their secrets to the wind. But he saw it all through the lens of his fear, through the knowledge of what might come, through the weight of prophecy that pressed down on him, like the sky had once pressed down on the earth, suffocating and inescapable. And Rhea, watching him, felt the change, felt the way he had begun to withdraw, to become more guarded, to look at their children with an expression that was no longer purely love, but something more complicated, something that made her heart ache with a sadness she could not fully articulate. The world turned, the seasons cycled, the light waxed and waned in its gentle rhythm, and beneath the golden surface, beneath the appearance of peace and harmony and perfect balance, something was shifting, something was changing. Something was preparing to break through like a seed breaking through soil, like a wave building far out at sea, like the future pressing against the present, demanding to be born, demanding to be acknowledged, demanding its turn upon the stage of existence. The golden age was not yet over, but it had begun its slow, inevitable decline, had begun the long, gentle fall from perfection toward whatever came next, toward the changes that were gathering like storm clouds on a distant horizon, still too far away to be threatening, but close enough to be seen, close enough to cast their shadows forward, close enough to whisper their promises of transformation and upheaval, and the eternal turning of the wheel that brings all things around again, that ensures nothing stays the same, that guarantees the only constant is change itself, flowing like water, inevitable as dawn, patient as stone, waiting for its moment to arrive. The dreams came more frequently now, rising from the depths of sleep like bubbles rising through water, breaking the surface of consciousness and leaving behind residues of fear that lingered long after waking. Cronus would find himself standing in landscapes he did not recognize, under skies that were darker than they should be, facing figures whose faces he could not quite see, but whose intentions he understood with perfect, terrible clarity. In these dreams, he was always falling, always being pushed aside, always watching as hands stronger than his own reached for the sickle, as voices younger than his declared that his time was over, that the golden age had ended, that the world needed new rulers, new visions, new powers to guide it forward. He would reach out to stop them, to explain, to plead for understanding, but his hands passed through them like smoke, like mist, like something that had already ceased to be substantial, that had already faded into memory, into history, into the past, and he would wake with the certainty that these were not merely dreams, but visions, not random phantoms conjured by an anxious mind, but glimpses of a future that was already written, already inevitable, already moving toward him with the patience of seasons, with the certainty of rivers flowing to the sea, with the inexorable quality of time itself, which moves in only one direction and cannot be bargained with, cannot be reasoned with, cannot be stopped. The prophecy had taken root in him like a seed planted in fertile soil, and it grew with each passing cycle, sending out tendrils that wrapped around his thoughts, that colored his perceptions, that transformed everything he saw and felt and understood. When he looked at his daughters, Hestia with her quiet dignity, Demeter with her generous spirit, Hera with her natural authority, he no longer saw only children to be loved and nurtured and protected. He saw potential threats, saw beings who might one day decide that he had ruled long enough, that the world needed change, that the pattern established when he overthrew Uranus should continue, should repeat, should turn the wheel once more. But it was not his daughters who haunted his dreams most intensely. It was the son who had not yet been born, the male child that Gaia's prophecy had shown him, the one who would be like him, strong and decisive, and willing to act when action was required. That was the one he feared most, the one who kept him awake in the quiet hours, the one who made his hands tremble when he held the sickle, remembering what he himself had done with it, imagining it being used against him in turn. And then Rhea told him she was with child again, and the fear that had been growing in him, like a shadow growing longer, as the sun descends, reached a new intensity, a new depth, a new quality of darkness that seemed to swallow all the golden light of the age around him. The child was born in a time that felt like autumn, though autumn was still learning its nature, still discovering what it meant to be the season of harvest and decline, of gathering in and letting go. It was a sun, strong and perfect, with eyes that seemed to hold depths within them, dark places, hidden places, spaces that light did not reach, but that possessed their own kind of power, their own kind of knowing. They named him Hades, and Cronus held him and felt the familiar mixture of love and fear, but the fear was stronger now, was more insistent, was like a voice speaking in his mind with increasing urgency, telling him that this child, or the next, or the one after that, would be his undoing, would be the instrument of his overthrow, would do to him what he had done to Uranus. He looked at Rhea, at the exhaustion in her face, at the love that shone in her eyes as she gazed at their son, and he felt something break inside him, some barrier that had been holding back the worst of his fear, the darkest of his impulses, the most desperate of his survival instincts. "Let me hold him," he said, and his voice was steady, was calm, was the voice of a father asking to embrace his child, though beneath it something else moved, something cold and determined and terrible in its necessity. Rhea handed him the infant, trusting, not seeing what was about to happen, not understanding that the golden age was ending in this moment, that the balance was tipping, that the wheel was turning once more, and bringing with it changes that could not be undone, choices that could not be taken back, actions that would echo through all the ages to come. Cronus looked at his son, at the small perfect face, at the eyes that had not yet learned to focus, at the hands that reached toward him with the instinctive trust that all infants have, the belief that the world is safe, that parents protect, that love is stronger than fear. And then he opened his mouth, wider than should have been possible, and he swallowed the child whole. It was not like eating, not like consuming food for nourishment or pleasure. It was something else, something that had no name, something that was more like a reversal of birth, like a pulling back of existence, like a denial of the future, like a desperate attempt to stop time itself, to prevent the prophecy from unfolding, to keep the wheel from turning by removing the ones who might turn it. The child did not die. That was not the nature of this act, not its purpose or its effect. The Titans were not mortal, could not be killed by ordinary means, and their children inherited this quality, this persistence of existence, this inability to simply cease. Instead, Hades was held, suspended, trapped in a space that was not quite inside Cronus and not quite anywhere else. A liminal place, a prison made of his father's fear, a darkness that was not death, but was not life either, was something in between, something that waited, something that endured. Rhea's scream was like the sound of the earth splitting, like the cry Uranus had made when the sickle cut him, like the voice of all mothers who have lost their children to violence, to war, to the terrible choices that fear makes when it overwhelms love. She reached for Cronus, tried to stop him, tried to understand what had just happened, but he was already turning away, already walking away, already retreating into himself, into the fortress of justification he was building in his mind, the walls of necessity he was constructing to protect himself from the horror of what he had done. It had to be, he said, and his voice was hollow, was empty, was the voice of someone trying to convince himself of something he did not truly believe. The prophecy. I had no choice. But Rhea heard no reason in his words, no logic that could justify what she had witnessed, what she had lost. She fell to her knees in the golden meadow, and her grief was so profound that the world itself seemed to feel it, seemed to respond to it. The light grew dimmer, the rivers flowed more quietly, the winds carried a chill that had not been there before, as if the golden age itself was mourning, was acknowledging that something fundamental had broken, that the balance had been lost, that the harmony they had all enjoyed was dissolving like mist in morning sun. Time passed, though it felt different now, felt heavier, felt marked by sorrow rather than by peace. The seasons continued their gentle cycle, but there was less joy in them, less celebration, less sense of abundance and blessing. The world was still beautiful, still functional, still ordered and harmonious in its surface appearance. But beneath that surface, something had changed, something had darkened, something had introduced a note of discord into the music that had been playing since Cronus first raised the sickle and cut sky from earth. And then Rhea felt life stirring within her again, and the cycle repeated, and another son was born. Poseidon, they named him, and he seemed to carry within him the essence of water itself, of rivers and seas and the deep places where currents moved in patterns too complex to predict, too powerful to control. He was beautiful, was perfect, was everything a child should be. Full of potential, full of promise, full of the future waiting to unfold. But Cronus looked at him and saw only the prophecy, saw only the threat, saw only another piece of the future that needed to be prevented, another turning of the wheel that needed to be stopped. And despite Rhea's pleas, despite her tears, despite her desperate attempts to hide the child, to protect him, to save him from the fate that had claimed his brother, Cronus took Poseidon in his hands and swallowed him as he had swallowed Hades, pulled him back into that space of suspension, that prison of fear, that darkness where his children waited, neither dead nor truly alive, held in a stasis that was meant to last forever, that was meant to prevent the prophecy from ever coming true. And Rhea's grief deepened, became something that had weight and substance, became something that changed her, that hardened something in her that had been soft, that planted seeds of resistance in soil that had been fertile only for love and trust and the simple joy of creation. She looked at Cronus and saw a stranger, saw someone she had thought she knew, but who had been transformed by fear into something else, something that could harm its own children, something that could prioritize its own survival over everything else, over love, over family, over the natural order of generations succeeding one another, of the young inheriting the world from the old. But she was not yet strong enough to act, not yet certain enough of what to do, not yet ready to make the choices that would need to be made. So she waited, and she grieved, and she walked alone through forests that seemed to mourn with her, through meadows where the grass grew less golden, along rivers that ran quieter, as if the world itself was holding its breath, as if existence itself was waiting for something, for some response to this violation, for some correction to this imbalance, for some force to rise up and set things right again. The pattern continued. Rhea bore another daughter, and Cronus swallowed her. Hera, regal and powerful even as an infant, pulled into the darkness with her brothers, held in that space of waiting, that prison of suspended time. And then Demeter, generous and life-giving, she too was taken, was swallowed, was added to the collection of children who existed but did not exist, who lived but did not live, who waited in the darkness for something, though they did not know what, though they could not have named it even if they had possessed the language to do so. And finally Hestia, the firstborn, the one who had brought such joy when she arrived, the one who had seemed to promise that the golden age would continue, would extend itself through new generations, would perpetuate its peace and harmony into an endless future. She too was taken, was swallowed, was pulled back into Cronus's fear, completing the set, sealing the prophecy, or so Cronus believed, preventing the future from unfolding as it had been shown to him, stopping the wheel from turning, breaking the cycle that had begun when he overthrew his father. But prophecies are not so easily thwarted. The future is not so easily prevented. The wheel of fate turns according to its own rhythm, its own logic, its own deep patterns that are woven into the fabric of existence itself, that cannot be cut or stopped or reversed by any act of will, no matter how desperate, no matter how determined, no matter how terrible. Rhea knew this, felt it in her bones, in her blood, in the deep places where mothers know things that cannot be proven or explained or justified by reason. She knew that the story was not over, that the cycle was not broken, that the prophecy would find a way to fulfill itself despite everything Cronus had done to prevent it. She knew that somewhere in the future, still hidden, still waiting, still gathering itself like a wave building far out at sea. There was an answer to this darkness, a response to this violation, a correction to this terrible imbalance. She walked through the world that was no longer quite golden, through the age that was no longer quite perfect. And she held her empty arms and felt the weight of her lost children, and she waited. She waited for the right moment, for the right opportunity, for the right alignment of circumstances that would allow her to act, to resist, to do what needed to be done to set things right again, to let the future unfold as it needed to unfold, to allow the wheel to turn as it needed to turn. And deep in the earth, Gaia felt it all, felt Rhea's grief and Cronus's fear, and the children suspended in their prison of darkness. She felt the imbalance, felt the wrongness of it, felt the way it violated the natural order of things, the way generations should flow, the way time should move, the way existence should perpetuate itself through creation rather than through prevention, through opening rather than through closing, through trust rather than through fear. And she began to dream new dreams, to see new possibilities, to sense the shape of what was coming, of who was coming, of the child who would be different, who would be saved, who would grow strong enough to do what needed to be done, to fulfill what needed to be fulfilled, to turn the wheel once more and bring the golden age to its necessary end, making space for whatever came next, for whatever new age was waiting to be born. The world turned, quieter now, darker now, carrying within it the weight of swallowed children, and a mother's grief, and a father's fear, and the patient, inexorable movement of fate itself, which cannot be stopped, cannot be prevented, cannot be denied, which moves like water moves, like seasons change, like dawn follows night, inevitable and certain and already on its way, already approaching, already preparing to break through the surface of the present and reveal itself in all its transformative power. The golden age was ending, had been ending since the moment Cronus first swallowed his child, but it had not yet ended completely. There was still time, still space, still one more turn of the wheel waiting to happen, one more birth waiting to occur, one more child waiting to be born who would change everything, who would fulfill the prophecy, who would bring the cycle to its completion and begin it anew, as cycles always do, as the universe always does, turning and turning in its eternal dance of creation and destruction, of rising and falling, of beginning and ending and beginning again. The world had grown quieter, as if it were holding its breath, as if it were waiting for something that had not yet arrived, but whose approach could be felt in the subtle shifts of wind, in the changing quality of light, in the way silence itself seemed to have weight and texture and meaning. The golden age had not ended. Not officially, not completely, but it had dimmed, had faded, had become something else, something that resembled what it had been, but lacked the essential quality that had made it golden, that had made it feel like a blessing, like a gift, like a time outside of time, when everything was as it should be. Cronus ruled still, sitting in his place of power, holding the sickle that had become both symbol and burden, both crown and chain. He looked out across the world he had fought to create, the world he had bled for, the world he had betrayed his father to bring into being, and he saw that it was still beautiful, still ordered, still functioning according to the patterns he had established. The rivers flowed, the forests grew, the mountains stood eternal against the sky. Nothing had changed, not really, not in any way that could be measured or quantified or pointed to as evidence of decline. But he felt the difference, felt it in the way his siblings looked at him now, with something that was not quite fear, and not quite pity, but something in between. Something that suggested they knew what he had done, what he had become, what fear had made of him. He felt it in the silence that followed him, in the way conversations would pause when he approached, in the way even the wind seemed to move more carefully around him, as if existence itself was uncertain how to respond to what he had done, how to accommodate this new reality where fathers devoured their children, where love was overwhelmed by fear, where the future was held prisoner in the darkness of the pasts, desperate attempt to perpetuate itself. He told himself he had done what was necessary, what was required, what any ruler would do when faced with the certainty of overthrow, with the knowledge of betrayal waiting in the future, like an ambush, like a trap, like a fate that could not be avoided except through the most extreme measures. He told himself that his children were not dead, were not suffering, were simply held, suspended, kept safe in a place where they could not fulfill the prophecy, could not become the instruments of his destruction, could not turn the wheel and repeat the cycle that he himself had set in motion when he raised the sickle against Uranus. But the dreams continued, and they were worse now, more vivid, more insistent, more certain in their message. He would see himself standing alone in a landscape that had become barren, empty, devoid of life or movement, or anything that suggested continuity, anything that suggested a future. And in these dreams, he would feel the weight of what he carried inside him, would feel his children moving in that space of suspension, would hear their voices calling to him, asking why, asking how long, asking when they would be released, when they would be allowed to live, when they would be permitted to become what they were meant to become. And sometimes, in the worst of these dreams, he would see another child, one he had not swallowed, one who had somehow escaped, who was growing somewhere beyond his sight, beyond his control, beyond his ability to prevent or contain or stop. This child would be standing in light while Cronus stood in shadow, would be surrounded by others while Cronus stood alone, would be holding the future in his hands while Cronus clutched desperately at a past that was already slipping away, already fading, already becoming nothing more than memory, than history, than a story that would be told in ages to come as a warning, as a tragedy, as an example of what happens when fear becomes stronger than love. He would wake from these dreams with his heart racing, with sweat cooling on his skin, with the certainty that something was wrong, that he had missed something, that the prophecy was not defeated, but was simply waiting, simply biding its time, simply gathering itself for the moment when it would break through all his defenses and fulfill itself, despite everything he had done to prevent it. But he pushed these feelings down, buried them beneath layers of justification and rationalization, and the desperate need to believe that he had succeeded, that he had won, that he had broken the cycle and secured his rule for all time. He walked through his world and tried to project confidence, tried to embody the strength and certainty that a ruler should possess, tried to convince himself and everyone around him that everything was as it should be, that the golden age continued, that nothing fundamental had changed. But Rhea knew better. Rhea, who had lost 5 children to her husband's fear, who had felt them torn from her arms, who had watched them disappear into that terrible darkness, who had grieved with a depth and intensity that had changed something essential in her nature, that had transformed her from the gentle, flowing presence she had been into something harder, something more determined, something that would not accept this reality, would not surrender to this fate, would not allow the prophecy to be thwarted by an act of violence disguised as necessity. She walked alone through forests that seemed to mourn with her, through meadows where the grass grew less vibrantly, along rivers that murmured their sympathy in voices too quiet to be heard, but present nonetheless, felt in the bones, in the blood, in the deep places where mothers carry their children, even after those children are gone. And as she walked, something grew in her, something that was not quite anger, and not quite hope, but something that combined elements of both, something that was resolve, that was determination. That was the absolute certainty that this would not happen again, that the next child would not share the fate of the others, that the prophecy would be allowed to unfold as it needed to unfold, as it was meant to unfold, as the universe itself required it to unfold. And then she felt it again, that familiar stirring, that sense of life beginning within her, of consciousness forming, of a new being preparing to enter the world. And this time, instead of joy mixed with fear, instead of hope shadowed by dread, she felt only clarity, only purpose, only the absolute knowledge of what needed to be done. She went to Gaia, to the earth herself, to the ancient consciousness that had dreamed the world into being, that had given birth to sky and mountains and all the titans who now walked upon her surface. She went to a place where the earth's presence was particularly strong, where the boundary between consciousness and matter was thin, where it was possible to speak and be heard, to ask and receive answers, to seek counsel from the oldest of all beings, the one who remembered everything, who knew everything, who understood the deep patterns that governed existence itself. "Mother," she said, and her voice was steady now, was strong, was the voice of someone who had moved through grief and emerged on the other side, transformed, tempered, ready to act. "Help me save this child. Show me how to protect him from his father's fear. Show me how to let the future unfold as it needs to unfold." And Gaia, who had been waiting for this moment, who had known it would come, who had been preparing for it in the slow, patient way that the earth prepares for everything, answered. Not with words, but with knowing, with images, with a sense of direction and purpose that settled into Rhea's consciousness like a map, like a path, like a certainty of what needed to be done and how to do it. She showed Rhea a place, distant and hidden, where mountains rose high enough to touch the sky, where caves went deep enough to hold secrets, where the world itself would conspire to protect and nurture, and keep safe the child who needed to be hidden, who needed to grow strong, who needed to survive long enough to fulfill the prophecy that Cronus feared, that the universe required, that the turning of the wheel demanded. And so, when her time came, Rhea did not go to Cronus, did not announce the birth, did not present the child for the terrible ritual that had claimed all the others. Instead, she went to that hidden place, to that distant refuge, to that cave in the mountains where the earth herself would serve as midwife, where the stones themselves would witness the arrival of the child, who would change everything, who would end the golden age, and begin whatever came next, who would turn the wheel once more and set in motion events that would echo through all the ages to come. The birth happened in darkness, in the deep places where light did not reach, but where something else existed, some other kind of illumination, some other way of seeing and being and understanding. And when the child emerged, when he took his first breath, when he opened his eyes for the first time, it was as if a flame had been lit in the deepest cave, as if a star had ignited in the blackness of night, as if something that had been waiting for a very long time had finally arrived, had finally been allowed to begin, had finally been given permission to exist. She named him Zeus, and even as an infant, even as a small, helpless being who knew nothing of prophecies or cycles or the weight of destiny that he would one day carry, there was something about him that felt immense, that felt significant, that felt like the answer to a question that had been asked long ago. Before time itself had learned to flow, before the world had learned to turn, before existence had discovered the patterns that governed its unfolding. Rhea held him, and for the first time since Hestia had been born, she felt joy that was not mixed with fear, hope that was not shadowed by dread, love that was not complicated by the knowledge of what was to come. She held him and knew that he was safe, that he would remain hidden, that he would grow strong enough to do what needed to be done, to become what he needed to become, to fulfill the role that the universe had written for him before he was born, before she was born, before any of them had emerged from the dreaming of Gaia and the vast consciousness of the earth itself. But she could not stay with him, could not remain in this hidden place, could not risk drawing Cronus's attention to this refuge, to this secret, to this child who represented everything he feared, everything he had tried to prevent, everything the prophecy had promised would come to pass despite all his desperate measures to stop it. She entrusted Zeus to others, to nymphs who dwelt in the mountains, to spirits of the wild places who understood the importance of what they were protecting, who would nurture him and guard him and keep him safe until the time came for him to emerge, to reveal himself, to step into the light and claim his destiny. She left him in a place where goats would provide milk, where bees would provide honey, where the sounds of wind moving through mountain passes would serve as lullabies, where the world itself would conspire to raise him, to strengthen him, to prepare him for what was to come. And then she returned to Cronus, returned to the world that had grown dimmer, returned to play the role that needed to be played, to complete the deception that would keep Zeus safe. That would buy him the time he needed to grow, to learn, to become strong enough to fulfill the prophecy. She went to the place where stones lay scattered, ancient and weathered, and shaped by time and wind and the patient work of water. She chose one carefully, one that was roughly the right size, the right weight, the right shape to be swaddled in cloth, to be presented as an infant, to be mistaken, by someone blinded by fear, by someone seeing only what he expected to see, by someone so consumed by the need to prevent the prophecy that he could not perceive the simple truth that was being placed before him. She wrapped the stone in soft fabric, held it as a mother holds a child, and went to Cronus with tears in her eyes. Real tears, tears of grief for the children she had lost, tears of fear for the child she was protecting, tears of sorrow for what her husband had become, for what fear had made of him, for the way love had been twisted into something unrecognizable, something terrible, something that violated the most fundamental bonds that should exist between parent and child, between past and future, between what is and what is meant to be. "Another son," she said, and her voice broke on the words. And the breaking was genuine, was real, was the sound of a heart that had been shattered and was holding itself together through sheer force of will, through the necessity of completing this deception, through the absolute requirement that Cronus believe, that he accept, that he take what was being offered, and never suspect that he was being deceived, that the prophecy was unfolding exactly as it had been foretold, that his fear had blinded him to the simple truth that you cannot stop the future, cannot prevent the turning of the wheel, cannot hold back time itself, no matter how desperately you try. Cronus looked at the bundle in her arms, and he saw what he expected to see, what his fear told him he would see, what his obsession with preventing the prophecy made inevitable. He saw another child, another threat, another piece of the future that needed to be stopped, that needed to be prevented, that needed to be swallowed, and held in that space of suspension where his other children waited, where they existed but did not exist, where they lived but did not live, where they remained frozen in a moment that refused to move forward, refused to unfold, refused to become what it was meant to become. He took the bundle from Rhea's arms, and without hesitation, without examination, without any doubt or question or moment of uncertainty, he opened his mouth and swallowed it, swallowed the stone wrapped in cloth, swallowed the deception, swallowed the lie that would be his undoing, that would ensure the prophecy's fulfillment, that would guarantee that everything he had done to prevent his overthrow would ultimately serve only to make that overthrow inevitable, necessary, just. The stone settled inside him, cold and hard and lifeless, so different from the living children who waited there in their suspension, so obviously not what he believed it to be. But he did not notice, did not feel the difference, did not perceive the truth that should have been obvious. His fear had made him blind, had made him see only what he expected to see, had trapped him in a prison of his own making, one that was far more effective than any physical cage, any actual confinement, any external force that might have been brought to bear against him. He believed he had won. He believed the prophecy was defeated. He believed that all his children were safely contained, safely prevented from fulfilling their destined roles, safely kept from turning the wheel and repeating the cycle that he had begun when he raised the sickle against his father. But far away, in a hidden cave in distant mountains, a child slept, nursed by nymphs, guarded by spirits, protected by the earth itself. Zeus, small and helpless now, but growing, always growing, developing, becoming. Moving toward the moment when he would emerge from hiding, when he would reveal himself, when he would do what needed to be done, what the prophecy had promised, what the universe required, what the turning of the wheel demanded. The goats that provided his milk moved quietly through the mountain passes, their bells chiming softly in the thin air, a sound like distant music, like a lullaby sung by the world itself. The bees that provided his honey hummed their ancient songs, working their patient magic, transforming sunlight and flowers into sweetness, into nourishment, into the sustenance that would help him grow strong. The wind moved through the caves, carrying with it the scent of wild places, of freedom, of spaces that existed beyond the reach of fear, beyond the grasp of those who would prevent the future from unfolding as it needed to unfold. And in the world below, the Golden Age continued its slow decline, its gradual fading, its transformation into something else, something that was not quite golden anymore, something that carried within it the seeds of its own ending, the promise of change, the certainty that nothing lasts forever, that all ages must end, that the wheel must turn, that what has been must give way to what will be, always, inevitably, eternally. Rhea walked through this world with empty arms and a full heart, with grief that was real and hope that was hidden, with the knowledge that she had done what needed to be done, that she had protected what needed to be protected, that she had ensured the prophecy would unfold as it was meant to unfold, as the universe required it to unfold, as the deep patterns of existence demanded it unfold. And somewhere in the darkness inside Cronus, 5 children waited, suspended in time, held in a space that was neither life nor death, but something in between, something that could not last forever, something that would one day end, that would one day be reversed, that would one day give way to release, to emergence, to the fulfillment of destinies that had been delayed but not defeated, postponed but not prevented, held back but not ultimately denied. The world turned, quieter now, dimmer now, but still turning, still moving, still flowing forward like a river that cannot be stopped, like dawn that cannot be prevented, like the future that approaches with the patience of seasons, with the certainty of tides, with the inevitability of breath following breath, moment following moment, age following age, in the eternal dance of time that began before beginning and will continue after ending, that encompasses all stories, all cycles, all turnings of the wheel, that brings everything around again, that ensures nothing stays the same, that guarantees the only constant is change itself, patient and inexorable and already on its way. Time moved differently in the Golden Age, or what remained of it, not in the measured way it would later move, not in the relentless forward march that mortals would come to know, but in a manner that felt more like breathing, like the slow rise and fall of tides, like the gentle turning of seasons that had not yet learned urgency, had not yet discovered the sharp edges of beginning and ending, of birth and death, of the moments that divide one age from another. The world was still beautiful, still abundant, still ordered according to the patterns that Cronus had established when he first took power, when he first separated sky from earth and allowed space for existence to unfold, for life to flourish, for the Golden Age to begin its long, luminous reign. The rivers still flowed clear and constant, their waters carrying no memory of violence, no echo of the children who had been swallowed, no whisper of the deception that had been enacted. The forests still grew thick and green, their canopies filtering sunlight into patterns of gold and shadow that moved across the forest floor like living things, like dancers, like spirits celebrating the simple fact of existence. The mountains stood as they had always stood, eternal and patient, their peaks touching clouds that drifted past like thoughts, like dreams, like the slow movement of consciousness across the face of the world. In the valleys between these mountains, meadows spread wide and soft, covered in grasses that swayed in winds that came from nowhere and went nowhere, that simply moved because movement was their nature, because stillness was not yet something the world understood, because everything in this age was alive with a kind of gentle, perpetual motion that suggested peace, that implied harmony, that spoke of balance maintained and order preserved. But beneath this surface of tranquility, beneath the appearance of an age that continued unchanged and unchanging, something else moved, something subtle. Something that could not be seen but could be felt by those who knew how to listen, who understood how to read the deeper currents that flowed beneath the visible world, who could sense the patterns that were forming, the forces that were gathering, the future that was preparing itself in the hidden places, in the spaces between what was and what would be. Cronus sat in his place of power, in the high seat from which he ruled, from which he observed the world he had fought to create, the world he had bled for, the world he had betrayed his father to bring into being. He held the sickle across his lap, that curved blade that had cut sky from earth, that had ended Uranus's reign and begun his own, that had become both symbol and burden, both crown and chain, both proof of his strength and reminder of his fear. He looked out across his domain and saw that it was good, saw that it functioned, saw that the patterns he had established continued to hold, continued to maintain the order and harmony that defined the Golden Age. The Titans moved through their appointed roles, tending to the various aspects of existence that required tending. Oceanus with his waters, Hyperion with his light, Themis with her laws, Mnemosyne with her memories. Everything continued as it should, as it had been designed to continue, as it was meant to continue for all time, or so he had believed, or so he had hoped, or so he had desperately needed to believe. But the dreams would not leave him alone. They came more frequently now, rising from the depths of sleep like bubbles rising through water, breaking the surface of consciousness and leaving behind residues of unease that lingered long after waking. In these dreams, he would feel the weight of what he carried inside him, would feel his children moving in that space of suspension where he had placed them, where he had imprisoned them, where he had tried to prevent the prophecy from unfolding. And sometimes, in the worst of these dreams, he would feel something else, something that did not belong, something that was not alive in the way his children were alive, something cold and hard and lifeless. He would reach for this feeling, would try to understand it, would attempt to grasp what it meant, but it would slip away before he could name it, before he could bring it into the light of conscious understanding, before he could recognize it for what it was. Evidence of deception, proof of failure, confirmation that the prophecy was not defeated, but was simply waiting, simply preparing, simply gathering itself for the moment of its fulfillment. He would wake from these dreams with his heart racing, with sweat cooling on his skin, despite the gentle warmth of the golden age that surrounded him, with a sense of unease that he could not name, could not explain, could not justify to himself, or to the siblings, who sometimes looked at him with expressions he could not quite read, with something in their eyes that might have been pity, or might have been knowledge, or might have been the simple awareness that nothing lasts forever, that all ages must end, that the wheel must turn regardless of how desperately anyone might try to stop it. Far away, in a place that existed beyond the reach of Cronus's sight, beyond the scope of his awareness, beyond the boundaries of his carefully maintained control, a child grew in secret, in safety, in the hidden spaces where the earth herself conspired to protect what needed to be protected, to nurture what needed to be nurtured, to prepare what needed to be prepared for the role. It would one day play in the unfolding of fate, in the turning of the wheel, in the ending of one age and the beginning of another. The cave on Crete was deep and ancient, carved by time and water into the living stone of the mountain, a space that felt both enclosed and infinite, both confining and free, both hidden and somehow central to everything, as if this small, secret place was actually the axis around which the entire world turned, the point from which all futures radiated, the source from which change would flow when the time came for change to flow. Inside this cave, Zeus slept and woke and slept again, following the rhythms that all infants follow, the patterns of need and satisfaction, of hunger and fullness, of waking and sleeping that define the earliest days of existence. But even as an infant, even as a small, helpless being who knew nothing of prophecies or destinies, or the weight of expectation that would one day settle upon his shoulders, there was something about him that felt different, that felt significant, that felt like potential waiting to unfold, like power waiting to be claimed, like a flame that was small now, but would one day grow into a conflagration that would consume the old world and make space for the new. The nymphs who tended him moved through the cave with quiet grace, with the gentle efficiency of those who understand the importance of their task, who know that they are protecting not just a child but a future, not just a life but a destiny, not just an infant, but the instrument through which the universe would correct an imbalance, would restore a pattern, would ensure that the cycle continued as it needed to continue, as it was meant to continue, as the deep laws of existence required it to continue. They brought him milk from the goats that grazed on the mountain slopes, from the sacred animals who seemed to understand that they were participating in something momentous, something that transcended their simple animal nature and connected them to the larger patterns of fate and prophecy and the turning of ages. The milk was sweet and rich, carrying in it the essence of wild places, of freedom, of life lived according to instinct and natural law rather than according to fear, or the desperate attempt to prevent what cannot be prevented. They brought him honey from the bees, who worked their patient magic in the mountain meadows, transforming sunlight and flowers into sweetness, into nourishment, into liquid gold that seemed to carry within it the very essence of the golden age itself, as if the bees were preserving something of that age, were capturing it and concentrating it, and offering it to the child, who would one day end that age, but who needed its nourishment now, needed its strength, needed its sweetness to grow strong enough to do what needed to be done. The cave itself seemed to sing to him, seemed to offer its own form of lullaby, its own kind of comfort. Water dripped from stalactites in rhythms that felt like heartbeats, like the pulse of the earth itself, like the slow, patient counting of time that had no urgency, that simply marked the passage of moments without judgment, without fear, without any sense that time was running out, or that change was approaching, or that the future was preparing itself in this very space, in this very moment, in the sleeping form of this very child. Wind moved through the passages and chambers of the cave, carrying with it the scent of wild thyme and mountain sage, of stone warmed by sun and cooled by night, of distances and heights, and the vast spaces that existed beyond the cave's entrance, beyond the immediate circle of protection, beyond the hidden refuge, where Zeus grew stronger with each passing day, with each cycle of sleeping and waking, with each moment that brought him closer to the time when he would emerge, when he would reveal himself, when he would step into the light and claim the destiny that had been written for him before he was born. Sometimes, in the deep of night, when the world outside the cave was wrapped in darkness and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, Rhea would come. Not in body. She could not risk that, could not draw attention to this place, could not leave any trail that Cronus might follow, any sign that might lead him to discover the deception, to find the child who represented everything he feared, everything he had tried to prevent, everything the prophecy had promised would come to pass. But she came in spirit, in dream, in the way that mothers can sometimes reach across distance and touch their children with love, with longing, with the fierce protective instinct that transcends physical separation, that bridges the gap between presence and absence, that maintains connection even when connection seems impossible. She would stand at the entrance to the cave in these dream visits, would look in at the sleeping child, would feel the mixture of grief and hope that had become her constant companion, her daily burden, her nightly prayer. She grieved for the children she had lost, for Hestia and Demeter and Hera and Hades and Poseidon, for the 5 who waited in darkness, who existed in suspension, who lived but did not live, who were held in a space that was neither death nor life, but something in between. Something that could not last forever, but that showed no sign of ending. No promise of release, no hope of emergence except through the actions of the one child who had escaped, who had been saved, who was growing strong in this hidden place while his siblings waited in their prison of fear. But she also felt hope, felt it growing in her like a seed planted in fertile soil, like a flame kindled in darkness, like the first hint of dawn appearing on the horizon after a night that seemed like it would never end. She felt it when she looked at Zeus, when she saw how he grew, how he thrived, how he seemed to embody something essential, something powerful, something that could not be contained or prevented or stopped. No matter how desperately Cronus tried, no matter how many children he swallowed, no matter how tightly he tried to hold on to power that was already slipping through his fingers like water, like sand, like time itself which cannot be grasped or held or prevented from flowing forward. She never stayed long in these dream visits, never lingered, never allowed herself the comfort of watching him sleep for hours, of memorizing every detail of his face, of imagining the future when she might hold him openly, might claim him publicly, might stand beside him as he fulfilled the prophecy and ended the age of fear that Cronus had created, that his terror had brought into being, that his desperate attempt to prevent the future had ironically made inevitable. She would leave with tears on her face that might have been grief, or might have been relief, or might have been some combination of both. Some emotional state that had no name because it was unique to her situation, unique to the terrible choice she had made, unique to the burden she carried of knowing that she had saved one child by sacrificing 5, that she had protected the future by abandoning the present, that she had ensured the prophecy's fulfillment by allowing her other children to remain imprisoned in darkness, waiting for a rescue that could only come through the actions of the brother they had never met, the sibling who had escaped the fate they had suffered. In the world beyond the cave, beyond the hidden refuge, beyond the secret place where the future was preparing itself, the Golden Age continued its slow, almost imperceptible decline. It was not obvious, not dramatic, not the kind of change that could be pointed to or measured or proven. The sun still rose and set in its gentle cycle. The seasons still turned in their soft progression. The world still functioned according to the patterns that had been established when Cronus first took power. But those who knew how to look, who understood how to read the subtle signs, who could sense the deeper currents that moved beneath the surface of visible reality, they felt it. They felt the change in the air, the shift in the quality of light, the way silence itself seemed to have grown heavier, more pregnant with meaning, more laden with the sense of something approaching, something preparing, something gathering itself in the hidden places and the spaces between, waiting for the right moment to emerge, to reveal itself, to transform everything. Themis felt it in her bones, in her blood, in the deep place where she understood law and justice and the proper order of things. She would stand sometimes and look toward the horizon, toward the distant mountains, where she did not know a child was hidden, but where she somehow sensed that something significant was occurring, something that would have profound implications for the order she had spent so long maintaining, for the balance she had worked so hard to preserve, for the laws that governed existence, and that could not be violated without consequence, without correction, without the universe itself rising up to restore what had been disrupted. Mnemosyne felt it in her memories, in the patterns she perceived when she looked backward through time, when she traced the cycles and repetitions that defined existence, when she saw how certain events echoed other events, how certain moments rhymed with other moments, how the past contained clues to the future for those who knew how to read them, who understood how to interpret them, who could see the deep structures that underlay the surface chaos of events and circumstances, and the seemingly random unfolding of history. She remembered Uranus's fall, remembered the prophecy that had been spoken then, remembered the pattern that had been established when son overthrew father, when the young replaced the old, when the wheel turned and brought change that seemed catastrophic in the moment, but that was actually necessary, was actually required, was actually the only way for existence to continue, for life to flow forward, for the future to unfold as it needed to unfold, rather than being held in stasis by those who feared change, who resisted transformation, who tried to prevent the inevitable turning of the wheel. And she looked at Cronus and saw the same pattern preparing to repeat itself, saw the same cycle beginning to turn once more, saw the same fate approaching that he had inflicted upon his father, now preparing to overtake him in turn. She saw it and said nothing, because what was there to say? How could she warn him of something he already knew, something he already feared, something he had already tried to prevent through actions that had only ensured the prophecy's fulfillment, that had only made inevitable what he most wanted to avoid? Gaia felt it most deeply of all, felt it in the earth itself, in the stone and soil and the deep places where her consciousness dwelt, where her awareness spread like roots through the substance of the world, connecting everything, knowing everything, understanding the patterns that governed existence at the most fundamental level. She felt the child growing in the hidden cave, felt his strength increasing, felt his destiny preparing itself like a storm gathering on the horizon, like a wave building far out at sea, like dawn approaching after a night that had lasted too long, that had grown too dark, that needed to end, so that light could return, so that balance could be restored, so that the cycle could continue as it needed to continue. She did not interfere, did not act, did not reach out to accelerate or delay what was coming. She simply waited, with the patience that only the earth possesses, with the certainty that comes from having witnessed countless cycles, countless turnings of the wheel, countless ages rising and falling and rising again. She waited and watched and felt the future preparing itself, felt it gathering momentum, felt it approaching the moment when it would break through the surface of the present and reveal itself in all its transformative power. The Titans felt it too, though most of them could not have named what they felt, could not have explained the unease that had begun to settle over them like morning mist, like the first chill of autumn, like the subtle shift in light that occurs when clouds begin to gather, when storms begin to form, when change begins to announce itself through signs too subtle to be obvious, but too persistent to be ignored. They went about their tasks, maintained their roles, continued to function as they had always functioned, but there was a quality to their movements, now that suggested uncertainty, that implied doubt, that spoke of an awareness that the age they had known, the world they had helped to create, the order they had worked to maintain, was not as stable as it appeared, was not as permanent as they had believed, was not as immune to change as they had hoped. Oceanus felt it in his waters, in the way currents moved with slightly less certainty, in the way tides pulled with slightly less regularity, in the way the rivers seemed to carry whispers that he could not quite hear, messages that he could not quite decipher, warnings that he could not quite understand, but that made him uneasy nonetheless. That made him look toward the future with something that was not quite fear, but was certainly not confidence, was certainly not the calm assurance that had characterized the golden age at its height. Hyperion felt it in his light, in the way sunshine seemed to carry a different quality now, seemed to illuminate things slightly differently, seemed to cast shadows that were deeper, that were darker, that suggested hidden places, secret spaces, things that existed beyond the reach of his illumination, beyond the scope of his awareness, beyond his ability to reveal or expose, or bring into the clarity of full visibility. And Cronus felt it most of all, felt it in the weight of the sickle that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day, felt it in the dreams that would not leave him alone, felt it in the stone that rested inside him alongside his children, cold and hard and lifeless, a presence that should have alerted him to the deception, but that his fear prevented him from recognizing, that his obsession with the prophecy prevented him from understanding, that his desperate need to believe he had succeeded prevented him from acknowledging. He would stand sometimes under the stars, under the vast canopy of night that spread above the world like a blanket, like a promise, like a reminder that existence was larger than any individual, larger than any age, larger than any attempt to hold back time or prevent change or stop the wheel from turning. He would stand there and hold the sickle and feel the weight of it, feel the burden of what he had done to obtain it, feel the cost of what he had done to keep it, feel the fear that had driven him to actions he could not undo, choices he could not take back, decisions that had seemed necessary in the moment, but that had transformed him into something he had never intended to become, something that was no longer quite a ruler, no longer quite a father, no longer quite himself. And sometimes, in those moments of stillness under the stars, he would feel it. The approach of something, the gathering of forces, the preparation of fate. He would feel it like a pressure in the air before a storm, like a tension in the earth before an earthquake, like the held breath before a scream, before a revelation, before a transformation that would change everything. That would end the age he had fought to create. That would fulfill the prophecy he had tried so desperately to prevent. But he would push these feelings down, would bury them beneath layers of denial and rationalization, and the desperate need to believe that he had succeeded, that he had won, that he had broken the cycle and secured his rule for all time. He would tell himself that the unease he felt was nothing, was meaningless, was simply the natural anxiety that any ruler feels, the normal concern that comes with responsibility, with power, with the burden of maintaining order and preserving harmony. He would tell himself these things, and sometimes he would almost believe them. But the dreams continued, and the weight of the sickle grew heavier, and somewhere deep inside him, in a place he refused to acknowledge, in a space he would not allow himself to examine, he knew. He knew that the prophecy was not defeated, that the cycle was not broken, that the wheel was still turning, still moving, still bringing the future toward him with the patience of seasons, with the certainty of tides, with the inevitability of breath, following breath, moment following moment, age following age. And in the hidden cave, Zeus slept, his breathing deep and steady, his small chest rising and falling with the rhythm of life itself, with the pulse of existence, with the heartbeat of the world that was preparing to change, that was gathering itself for transformation, that was counting down the moments until the prophecy would be fulfilled, until the wheel would turn, until the golden age would end, and something new would begin, something that could not yet be named, could not yet be imagined, could not yet be understood, but that was coming nonetheless, was approaching, was already on its way. The nymphs watched over him, the goats provided their milk, the bees brought their honey, and the cave sang its ancient lullabies, and the earth held him safe, and the future waited, patient and certain and inevitable, like dawn waiting to break, like spring waiting to arrive, like the next breath waiting to be drawn, waiting to be released, waiting to begin the next cycle, the next turning, the next age in the eternal dance of time that began before beginning and will continue after ending, that encompasses all stories, all prophecies, all turnings of the wheel that brings everything around again, that ensures nothing stays the same, that guarantees the only constant is change itself. The world exhaled slowly, softly, like someone settling into sleep, like someone surrendering to dreams, like someone letting go of the day that has passed and opening themselves to the night that has arrived, to the darkness that holds within it the seeds of morning, the promise of light, the certainty that nothing lasts forever, that all things change, that the wheel turns, always, eternally, bringing endings that are also beginnings, bringing losses that are also gains, bringing deaths that are also births, in the endless cycle that defines existence itself. And somewhere between sleeping and waking, between past and future, between what was and what would be, the prophecy breathed, patient and alive, waiting for its moment, preparing for its fulfillment, gathering itself like a wave, like a storm, like a force that could not be stopped, could not be prevented, could not be denied, no matter how desperately anyone tried, no matter how many children were swallowed, no matter how tightly anyone tried to hold on to power that was already slipping away, already fading, already becoming nothing more than memory, than history, than a story that would be told in ages to come as a reminder that fate cannot be thwarted, that prophecy cannot be prevented, that the wheel must turn, always, inevitably, eternally. And so we arrive at the ending, though perhaps ending is not quite the right word, because in truth, nothing in the cosmos ever truly ends. It simply transforms, shifts, turns like the great wheel that spins through eternity, bringing seasons and ages and the slow, patient unfolding of time itself. What we call an ending is merely a pause, a breath held before the next breath is drawn, a moment of stillness before the next movement begins. The way night is not the death of day, but simply its resting, its preparation for the dawn that waits, patient and certain, beyond the horizon. The golden age continued, but it was fading now, fading the way all things fade when their time has come, when their purpose has been fulfilled, when the wheel turns and brings something new into being. It was not a dramatic fading, not a sudden collapse or catastrophic ending, but rather a gentle dimming, like the way light softens as evening approaches, like the way colors mute as autumn settles over summer's brightness, like the way a song diminishes as it nears its final notes, growing quieter, softer, preparing for the silence that will follow, the silence that is not absence, but simply space, room for the next song to begin. The rivers still flowed, but their waters seemed to carry a different quality now, seemed to move with a kind of knowing, as if they understood that they were witnessing the closing of one chapter and the opening of another, as if they were aware that the world they moved through was preparing for transformation, for change, for the fulfillment of prophecy that had been written long ago, before time had learned to measure itself, before the present had separated itself from the future, before what would be had distinguished itself from what was. The forest still grew, their leaves still caught the sunlight and transformed it into life. Their roots still reached deep into the earth and drew sustenance from stone and soil. But there was something different in the quality of their growth now, something that suggested waiting, anticipation, the held breath before revelation, before emergence, before the moment when what has been hidden reveals itself, when what has been growing in secret steps into the light, when what has been preparing in darkness finally announces itself to the world. The mountains stood as they had always stood, eternal and patient, their peaks touching clouds that drifted past like thoughts, like memories, like the slow movement of consciousness across the face of existence. But even the mountains seemed to feel it now, seemed to sense the approaching change, seemed to lean forward slightly, as if listening, as if watching, as if waiting for the moment that was coming, that was approaching, that was already on its way, though it had not yet arrived, though it had not yet manifested, though it remained suspended in that space between potential and actuality, between prophecy and fulfillment, between what must be and what is. Kronos' reign had grown heavy, had accumulated shadows the way valleys accumulate mist, the way stones accumulate moss, the way anything that remains in one place for too long begins to show the marks of time, begins to reveal the cost of its own continuation, begins to demonstrate that nothing can last forever, that all things must change, that the wheel must turn regardless of how desperately anyone might try to hold it still, to keep it from moving, to prevent the future from arriving. He sat in his place of power, but the throne felt different now, felt less like a seat of authority, and more like a burden, like a weight that pressed down upon him, like a responsibility that had transformed into an obligation that had transformed into a prison. The sickle lay across his lap, that curved blade that had once been a symbol of liberation, of freedom, of the power to change the world, to end tyranny, to create something new. But now it felt like nothing more than a reminder, a monument to choices that could not be unmade, actions that could not be undone, consequences that could not be avoided. The dreams came every night now, rising from the depths of sleep like bubbles, rising through dark water, breaking the surface of consciousness, and leaving behind residues of unease that never quite faded, that lingered through the waking hours, that coloured everything with a subtle tint of anxiety, of fear, of the growing awareness that something was approaching, something was changing, something was preparing to emerge that would transform everything. That would end the age he had fought to create. That would fulfill the prophecy he had tried so desperately to prevent. Inside him, his children waited in their prison of suspension, waited in that space between life and death, between existence and non-existence, between being and becoming. And alongside them, the stone rested, cold and hard and lifeless, a presence he felt but could not understand, a weight he carried but could not interpret, a sign he perceived but could not read, because fear had made him blind, because terror had closed his eyes, because the desperate need to believe he had succeeded prevented him from seeing the evidence of his failure, the proof of his deception, the confirmation that the prophecy was not defeated, but was simply waiting, simply preparing, simply gathering itself for the moment of its fulfillment. He would stand under the stars and feel the weight of time pressing down upon him, would feel the slow, inexorable turning of the wheel, would sense the approach of change the way animals sense the approach of storms, the way birds sense the approach of winter, the way all living things sense the movements of fate, the shifts in the deep patterns that govern existence, the preparations that the universe makes before transformation, before revelation, before the moment when everything changes and nothing remains the same. But far away, in the hidden cave on Crete, Zeus continued to grow, continued to strengthen, continued to develop in the secret place where the earth herself conspired to protect him, to nurture him, to prepare him for the role he would one day play, for the destiny he would one day fulfill, for the prophecy he would one day embody. He was no longer an infant now, no longer helpless, no longer small. Time had worked its patient magic, had transformed the child who had been hidden into something more, something stronger, something that carried within it the seeds of transformation, the potential for change, the power to end one age and begin another. The nymphs still tended him, but they watched him now with a mixture of care and awe, with the awareness that they were not simply raising a child, but preparing an instrument of fate, not simply protecting a life, but safeguarding a future, not simply nurturing a being, but cultivating a force that would reshape the world, that would restore balance, that would ensure the wheel continued to turn as it needed to turn, as it was meant to turn, as the deep laws of existence required it to turn. The cave still sang its ancient lullabies, still offered its protection, still held him safe in its stone embrace. But even the cave seemed to understand now that this protection could not last forever, that the time of hiding was approaching its end, that the moment of emergence was drawing near, that soon the child who had been concealed would step into the light, would reveal himself, would claim the destiny that had been written for him before he was born. Before the Golden Age began, before Cronus took power, before time itself had learned to separate past from future, before the wheel had begun its eternal turning, Rhea still came in her dreams, still visited in spirit, still watched over the son she had saved by sacrificing the others, still carried the burden of her choice, the weight of her deception, the cost of her defiance. But there was something different in her visits now, something that suggested not just hope but certainty, not just possibility, but inevitability, not just the wish that things might change, but the knowledge that they would change, that they must change, that the wheel was already turning, that the prophecy was already fulfilling itself, that the future was already arriving though it had not yet fully manifested, though it had not yet completely revealed itself, though it remained suspended in that space between what is and what will be. She looked at Zeus and saw not just her son, but the instrument of liberation, the agent of transformation, the force that would free her other children from their prison, that would end Cronus's reign of fear, that would restore balance to existence, that would ensure the cycle continued as it needed to continue, as it was meant to continue, as the deep patterns of fate required it to continue. And in seeing this, she felt her grief begin to transform, begin to shift, begin to change into something else. Not quite joy, not quite relief, but something that was related to both, something that was connected to the awareness that suffering has purpose, that sacrifice has meaning, that even the darkest moments are part of a larger pattern, a deeper design, a greater unfolding that encompasses all things, that includes all experiences, that uses even pain and loss and separation as threads in the vast tapestry of existence, as notes in the eternal song of becoming. The Titans felt the change most acutely now, felt it in their bones, in their blood, in the deep places where instinct dwells, where awareness lives below the level of conscious thought, where knowledge exists without words, without explanation, without the need for rational understanding. They moved through their roles with increasing unease, with growing uncertainty, with the awareness that the world they had known was preparing to transform, that the age they had helped to create was approaching its end, that the patterns they had maintained were beginning to shift, to change, to rearrange themselves into new configurations, new possibilities, new forms that they could not yet see, but could already sense, could already feel approaching, like dawn approaching, like spring approaching, like the next breath approaching after the held breath, after the pause, after the moment of suspension that precedes all transformation, all change, all turning of the wheel. Oceanus felt it in his waters, felt the currents shifting, felt the tides pulling with a different rhythm, felt the rivers carrying whispers of change, messages of transformation, announcements of the future that was preparing to arrive. Hyperion felt it in his light, felt the way sunshine seemed to illuminate things differently now, seemed to reveal patterns that had always been present, but had not been visible before, seemed to cast shadows that pointed towards something, that indicated direction, that suggested movement toward a destination that was not yet visible, but was already approaching, was already on its way. Themis felt it in her understanding of law and justice and the proper order of things, felt the way the universe was preparing to correct an imbalance, to restore a pattern, to ensure that the cycle continued as it needed to continue. She looked at Cronus and saw not a tyrant, but a tragedy, not a villain, but a victim of his own fear, not someone to be condemned, but someone to be pitied, because he had allowed terror to transform him, had allowed anxiety to corrupt him, had allowed the desperate attempt to prevent the future, to destroy the present, to poison the age he had fought to create, to ensure that the very thing he most feared would come to pass, would fulfill itself, would manifest exactly as the prophecy had promised. Mnemosyne felt it in her memories, felt the patterns repeating, felt the cycles turning, felt the way history rhymes with itself, the way certain moments echo other moments, the way the past contains the seeds of the future for those who know how to read them, who understand how to interpret them, who can see the deep structures that underlie the surface chaos of events and circumstances and the seemingly random unfolding of time. She remembered Uranus's fall and saw Cronus's fall approaching, remembered the prophecy that had been spoken and saw it preparing to fulfill itself, remembered the pattern that had been established and saw it preparing to repeat. Because this is what patterns do, this is what cycles do, this is what the wheel does. It turns always, eternally, bringing endings that are also beginnings, bringing losses that are also gains, bringing deaths that are also births. And Gaia, ancient and patient, felt it most deeply of all, felt it in the earth itself, in the stone and soil, and the deep places where her consciousness dwelt, where her awareness spread like roots through the substance of the world. She felt Zeus growing stronger, felt the prophecy gathering itself, felt the moment of transformation approaching like a wave building far out at sea, like a storm gathering on the horizon, like dawn preparing to break after a night that had lasted too long, that had grown too dark, that needed to end so that light could return, so that balance could be restored, so that the wheel could continue its eternal turning. She did not interfere, did not act, did not reach out to accelerate or delay what was coming. She simply waited, with the patience that only the earth possesses, with the certainty that comes from having witnessed countless cycles, countless turnings of the wheel, countless ages rising and falling and rising again. She waited and watched and felt the future preparing itself, felt it gathering momentum, felt it approaching the moment when it would break through the surface of the present and reveal itself in all its transformative power, in all its terrible beauty, in all its necessary inevitability. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, marking time in the way that stars mark time, which is to say without urgency, without anxiety, without any sense that one moment is more important than another, that one age is more significant than another, that anything that happens in the brief span of mortal existence is anything other than a single breath in the eternal respiration of the cosmos, a single heartbeat in the infinite pulse of existence, a single note in the endless song that began before beginning and will continue after ending, that encompasses all stories, all prophecies, all turnings of the wheel. The seasons continued their slow progression, summer fading into autumn, autumn fading into winter, winter fading into spring, each season giving way to the next in the eternal dance of transformation, in the endless cycle of death and rebirth, of ending and beginning, of the wheel turning and bringing change that is not destruction, but simply transformation, not loss, but simply shift, not ending, but simply transition from one state to another, from one form to another, from one age to another, and in this slow, patient unfolding, in this gentle, inexorable progression, there was no violence, no drama, no sudden catastrophe or dramatic revelation. There was simply the quiet certainty of fate fulfilling itself, of prophecy manifesting, of the wheel turning as it had always turned, as it would always turn, as it must turn, because this is the nature of existence itself, because change is not an aberration, but the fundamental principle, because nothing remains the same, because everything flows, because the only constant is transformation itself. The golden age faded like evening fades into night, like summer fades into autumn, like one breath fades into the next breath, not with violence but with gentleness, not with catastrophe but with grace, not with destruction, but with the simple, patient acknowledgement that all things have their time, that all ages have their span, that all cycles must complete themselves so that new cycles can begin, so that the wheel can continue its turning, so that existence itself can continue its eternal unfolding. And as the golden age faded, as Cronus's reign grew heavy with shadows, as Zeus continued to grow stronger in his hidden cave, as the prophecy gathered itself for fulfillment, as the Titans felt the approach of change, as Gaia waited with patient certainty, as the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, as the seasons turned in their eternal cycle, as the rivers flowed toward the sea, and the sea flowed toward the sky, and the sky flowed toward the earth in the endless circulation of water and air and life itself. In all of this, there was a kind of peace, a kind of rightness, a kind of harmony that transcended the individual experiences of fear or hope or anxiety or anticipation, that existed at a level deeper than emotion, deeper than thought, deeper than consciousness itself. Because this is how the universe works, how existence unfolds, how time moves forward, not in straight lines but in cycles, not in permanent states but in constant transformation, not in fixed forms but in endless flow. The wheel turns, always, eternally, bringing change that is not chaos but pattern, bringing transformation that is not random but purposeful, bringing endings that are also beginnings, bringing losses that are also gains, bringing deaths that are also births. And in understanding this, in accepting this, in surrendering to this fundamental truth of existence, there is a kind of peace that transcends circumstance, a kind of calm that exists beneath the surface turbulence of events, a kind of stillness that persists through all change, all transformation, all turning of the wheel. It is the peace of the earth that remains solid beneath shifting seasons, the calm of the ocean that remains vast beneath passing storms, the stillness of the stars that remain constant beneath the turning of ages, the quiet certainty that existence itself continues, that life itself persists, that the wheel itself keeps turning, always, eternally, bringing the future into the present, bringing the potential into the actual, bringing what must be into what is. And so the story pauses here, at this moment of suspension, at this point of balance between what was and what will be, between the golden age that is fading and the new age that is preparing to dawn, between Cronus's reign that is ending and Zeus's reign that is beginning, between the prophecy that was spoken and the prophecy that will be fulfilled. It pauses here, but it does not end, because nothing truly ends, because everything simply transforms, because the wheel continues to turn, bringing the next chapter, the next age, the next cycle in the eternal dance of existence. But for now, in this moment, in this space between breaths, in this pause between heartbeats, there is simply the quiet awareness of change approaching, of transformation preparing, of the future gathering itself for emergence. There is simply the gentle fading of the golden age, like light fading at evening, like warmth fading at autumn's end, like one season fading into the next in the eternal progression of time. There is simply Cronus sitting with his burden, Zeus growing with his destiny, Rhea carrying her hope, Gaia holding her patience, the Titans feeling their unease, the stars wheeling their patterns, the seasons turning their cycles, the rivers flowing their courses, the wheel turning its eternal rotation. And in all of this, there is peace. Not the peace of permanence, not the peace of stasis, not the peace of things remaining forever unchanged, but the deeper peace of acceptance, the profounder calm of understanding, the more fundamental stillness of knowing that change is natural, that transformation is necessary, that the wheel must turn, that ages must end so that new ages can begin, that the old must fade so that the new can emerge, that what was must give way to what will be, always, eternally, in the endless unfolding of existence itself. So let yourself rest now, let yourself relax into this understanding, let yourself surrender to the gentle rhythm of change, of transformation, of the wheel turning. Let yourself feel the peace that exists beneath all surface turbulence, the calm that persists through all transformation, the stillness that remains constant through all change. Let yourself breathe with the rhythm of the cosmos, with the pulse of existence, with the heartbeat of the universe that began before beginning and will continue after ending, that encompasses all stories, all ages, all turnings of the wheel. Let your breath slow, let your body relax, let your mind release its grip on waking concerns and conscious thoughts. Let yourself drift like clouds drift across the sky, like leaves drift on the surface of water, like consciousness drifts between waking and sleeping, between awareness and rest, between the day that has passed and the night that has arrived. Let yourself float in that space between, in that moment of suspension, in that pause between breaths, where everything is possible, where everything is potential, where the future waits to unfold, patient and certain and inevitable. The golden age fades into silence, into memory, into the past that becomes story, that becomes myth, that becomes the foundation upon which new ages build themselves. New cycles begin themselves. New turnings of the wheel manifest themselves. And in this fading, there is no tragedy, no loss, no cause for grief. Because what fades does not disappear but simply transforms, simply changes form, simply becomes something else, something new, something that carries within it the seeds of what came before, the essence of what was, the pattern that will repeat itself in new forms, in new ways, in new ages that will themselves one day fade and transform and give way to other ages, in the endless cycle, in the eternal turning, in the infinite dance of existence itself. So rest now, rest easy, rest peacefully, knowing that you are part of this great cycle, this eternal turning, this endless dance. Rest knowing that change is natural, that transformation is necessary, that endings are also beginnings, that what fades makes space for what emerges, that the wheel turns, always, bringing the future into the present, bringing the potential into the actual, bringing what must be into what is. Rest now, as the golden age rests, as Cronus rests in his heavy throne, as Zeus rests in his hidden cave, as the earth rests beneath the turning seasons, as the stars rest in their eternal patterns, as the wheel rests in its constant motion, as existence itself rests in its endless unfolding. Rest, and let the story continue without you. Let the wheel turn without your watching. Let the future arrive without your anticipation. Let change come without your resistance. Let transformation occur without your interference. Rest, and dream of cycles turning, of seasons changing, of ages rising and falling and rising again, of the eternal dance of existence that includes all things, that encompasses all stories, that holds all beings in its vast embrace. Rest, and let yourself be held by the earth, by the night, by the gentle darkness that is not absence but presence, not emptiness but fullness, not ending but transition, not death but transformation, not loss but change, not conclusion but continuation in a different form, in a different way, in a different age. Rest now, and let the story fade like evening fades into night, like consciousness fades into sleep, like one breath fades into the next breath in the eternal rhythm of existence. Rest, and know that all is well, that all is as it should be, that the wheel turns, that the cycle continues, that existence itself persists, that life itself flows forward, that the future arrives, patient and certain and inevitable, bringing with it new stories, new ages, new turnings of the wheel that began before beginning and will continue after ending, forever and always, in the eternal now that holds all time, all space, all being in its infinite embrace. Rest now. The story is complete, but the wheel keeps turning. Sleep well, and let the cycles carry you gently into dreams, into peace, into the deep rest that restores and renews and prepares you for the next turning, the next beginning, the next breath in the eternal respiration of existence itself. Rest. The golden age fades, the prophecy waits, the wheel turns, and all is well, all is well. Sleep now.